Recording in progress.
Good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee. We're regularly scheduled because of the variety of things going on in the holiday, but this is the last meeting of the year. And I just want to recognize the members of the committee who are here and online, and those members of the council who are joining us, as well as ask the planning board members to introduce themselves. So I'm Lyle Baker, chair of the committee. I'm joined by the vice chair, Councilor Oliver, Councilor Albright from Ward 2, Councilor Guest from Ward 5, and I don't, let's see who among our colleagues. Councilor Maliki is here, not a member of the committee, but welcome. And we've got a sufficient number for a quorum, but we can operate. But I don't see anybody else yet. Mr. McCormick, with the planning board, do you want to introduce your colleagues present and those attending online?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm Kevin McCormick, Chair of the Planning Board. Me is Ed Daly, and online is Amy Dean and Peter Dorminger.
Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. And we're going to be joined as part of the conversation by members of the planning board staff, who I'll just ask to introduce themselves when we get started. But at the outset, I want to thank Ms. Norton for her exemplary service to this committee during the past year. None of this work would have been possible without all of her time and effort and really quite considerable skill. And I just want to say that at the end of the year, and
And for keeping people in mind.
yeah, including the chair and the vice. And also I want to acknowledge the vice chair, whom all of you know, spent an enormous amount of time on a variety of topics, but including Berto, which we are all glad very much to see get done, and it is now on its way to implementation. And so we're glad to see that done. I do want to introduce Lisa Pavel, who is here. She is the new compliance coordinator in the clerk's office. And of her own free will, she decided to come sit in on our meeting.
She'll be gone in 15 minutes.
Which does demonstrate a certain lack of judgment.
It's the Christmas spirit. We're delighted with the holiday spirit anyway. Okay, so we've got a variety of things to take care of tonight, and we're going to go through them. But first, we have an appointment of Hema Narayan, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, to the Economic Development Commission. Do we have?
Yeah, I think she's
online?
Yeah, she's up to.
Ah, okay, you're up, and in our screen, you're in the corner. In your screen, you're right in the center. Anyway, so can you make that screen view so that we can rather than gallery view? We've been joined, I think, by Councilor Kalis online. See that? Is that correct? Yeah. And Councilor Kurtzman, I think, too. So welcome both.
When she begins talking, it'll switch to her.
Okay. So welcome. It's customary to introduce you by asking you to introduce yourself. Do you want to say a little about yourself and why you're interested in being appointed to the Economic Development Commission?
Sure, yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Hema Narayanan, and we've lived here in Newton for about 10 years. Prior to this, we were in Brookline, and I was a part of the Economic Development Advisory Board there. And now that my children have flown the nest, I figured it was time to re-engage with the community. And so thank you for this opportunity to introduce myself. And my apologies for not being there in person. I am running a low fever, and so decided to stay away and do this online. I want to serve on the Economic Development Commission of Newton because I am excited about fostering sustainable economic growth that benefits businesses, enhances the community, and really helps preserve Newton's unique character. My experience over 25 years has been in both line and staff positions in retail and food service. And I've been an entrepreneur for many years. And this has, I think, equipped me with skills to collaborate with stakeholders, develop initiatives, develop innovative strategies, and support the initiatives that attract investment, helps grow the tax base, and create jobs. I'm particularly drawn to Newton's small and medium-sized businesses and startups, and see this as an opportunity to contribute to the city's strengths to ensure its long-term prosperity and growth. And serving on this commission would allow me to contribute to shaping policies that promote sustainability, inclusivity, and economic resilience for all residents and businesses. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Members of the committee, questions? Yes, Councilor Albright.
First, thank you for being willing to serve. Appreciate that.
Please.
Every year around this time of the year, we set the Tax Classification Act. And, you know, we charge businesses 175% of the residential tax rate. And it makes me think about the fact, I talked about it in council the other day, that, you know, it's only a small percentage of our taxes really comes from the business community. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we had more business in Newton? I think it would be wonderful. I would love the Economic Development Commission to think about that. Do we want more business? If so, where and what? Will it help? It will help our residential taxes. So as you join that commission and think about the issues, think about, you know, what kinds of businesses do we want to attract? What can we do to attract those businesses? And I'm wondering what your point of view on that is. Do you think there's room in Newton for more businesses?
I think there is, and you know, at the last EDC meeting, there was they did share information on the percentage of taxes that comes from residents versus businesses, and I think the kind of businesses we attract, you know, really helping having a diversified portfolio of businesses. You know, the small single owner or small family-sized businesses are definitely constrained. But being able to attract medium and potentially larger businesses, I think will help move us in the right direction in terms of, you know, increasing that the tax base from businesses. And I think for the smaller businesses, you know, there's services that I think this city can provide, or the EDC can provide, in terms of funding, continued access to resources that the state has, etc. But ultimately, you know, I think as we were looking at Newton and the surrounding towns, Wellesley, Waltham, Cambridge, Brookline, etc., it did seem that the recurring theme was, you know, a greater share of tax revenue was being drawn from residents. And I think it does call for kind of long-term planning to see how we can shift some of that burden away from residents, you know, and not necessarily burden the businesses, but attract businesses that are able to pay a higher share of taxes.
As you work on the commission, help, you know, tell the planning department what you think, and tell us what you think we need to do to do that. So thank you very much for being willing to serve.
Of course, thank you.
Other members of the committee? Councilor Getz.
Yeah, again, thank you for stepping up and offering your skill set and your expertise to the community and to Newton. I appreciate the budgets that you have experience with. That's impressive. And I also appreciate the focus on small businesses, because Newton has quite a bit of historic older businesses, and it would be great to keep them, but to sort of then weave in what you know to these smaller businesses that are, some of them are on lifeline, like the kind of, you know, end of their cycle. But it would be great if in some creative way come up with mechanisms to, you know, help them continue. Because that's what makes Newton quite unique, you know, in terms of village centers are smaller businesses. And so it's something that's very important. So again, thank you for offering to serve.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
Online, I see a hand raised. I'm sorry, I think we've been joined by Counselor Wright, and also I think Counselor Lipoff, and is there anyone else? Jordan, anyone I'm missing? Counselor. Absolutely. Three, you're right here. Anyway, I'll take some Milano for you. All right. Who's gonna hand up? Counselor Wright.
Okay, thank you. I'm out in Wisconsin, actually, we're having a snowstorm, and I have to have my laptop open so you can see me, but I'm facing my monitor, so I'm not purposely looking away from you guys, but I got a bigger view here. Thank you so much for serving, and my question is, besides rent, the cost of rent, what do you see as some of the biggest blocks for new businesses to come to Newton or to open in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's macro factors at play that affect not just Newton, but many communities. There's economic, there's climate conditions that are changing. There's an aging population. The nature of work is changing, where people work, and the kind of work that they do. And I think retail, especially including food service, a lot of these factors affect retail and they affect food service. And so being able to look at these macro factors and then really kind of taking these factors into play as we look at the mix of businesses and the conditions that they encounter, I think has become crucial. And one small example is, a lot of cities and towns have a shared kind of a farmer's market, if you will, that extends beyond just the summer season. It goes throughout the year because there are a number of smaller businesses that don't necessarily want to get locked into real estate, but still want access to communities. So being able to have a space that really has a portfolio of businesses that shuffle through it. And Boston's done a good job. Somerville's done a good job of attracting diversified small businesses that aren't necessarily locked into large rents, but are still able to offer their services to communities with kind of a lower capital investment. So I think those kinds of I guess innovative, out of the box thinking really starts to make an impact. And it creates an interesting mix for the residents, right? You're not locked into the same business being there for multiple years. You are able to partake of, what's kind of innovative and fun and exciting from a trend standpoint.
Okay, Councilor Danbury, anyone else?
Yes, thank you. I join everyone else in thanking you for being willing to serve. Thank you very much. And as an offshoot of what you have just said, one suggestion that I might have on places to look to locate year-round, in the summertime, of course, we like to have farmers markets outside, but in the wintertime, places like the Allen Center in West Newton might be a possibility. They have a large barn and they may have a day when they could do something like that. If not them, there are other venues that we could go to in the city where I think it would be a marvelous idea to encourage that year-round.
You're right. Yep, that's great.
Anyone else on the committee or on the council? I just want to say that I also want to express my gratitude, but acknowledge your quite remarkable background in the hospitality industry, so to speak. Large.
Thank you.
I think that brings a dimension of experience to the council, the commission, which I think will be a real value. So thank you very much for being willing to serve.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Councilor Getz?
I move that we accept the nomination.
Okay, Councilor Getz, Ward 5 has moved your appointment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. I think are all of us who,
Yes.
we've got all 8 of us. Great. Okay. See Councilor Keelis, and then Counselor Chrisman and Counselor Roosevelt, and also Counselor Maliki, and we've been joined by Counselor Leary and also Counselor Lipow. Anybody else in the council here that I'm not catching? Okay, all right. Thank you very much. You're welcome to stay and listen in on the conversation, but you're also not required to, so you can decide for yourself. Okay.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
So the next item is one we've been continuing working on, actually two items in parallel. Item 8524, discussion and possible amendments to enhance the preservation of existing homes. And then a 4124, amend the setbacks in MR zones to encourage preservation of existing buildings. And without repeating the docket items in their entirety, we're trying to schedule this at the beginning of the conversation tonight because we hopefully will be joined by our consultants, and we recognize that may not have the same desire to stay up late like the rest of us. So I'm going to ask the members of the planning department to come to the table and join us and help present what they have done on this item, and we can then talk about it.
I will.
So when you, for the purposes of the record and the people who are watching who may not know, when I'll just ask each member of the department and field the representative to identify themselves again, just at the start of the conversation, and then we'll go around from there. Zach, do you want to start?
I'm going to start us off. So I'm Zach Lamel, head of the long range planning team within the planning department. And after I get done a bit, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren. Report from UTIL, and then hopefully we'll have a conversation and we'll get some insight from all of you on how to best move forward.
Okay.
So next slide. Is this okay in this mode, or
Can we get to full screen, or what do we do?
So,
Great.
so we're gonna dive into what we think is a kind of specific zoning proposal that kind of responds to the goals and objectives that we've heard from the council, the committee, and the desire to do something quickly. That's where we're going to end up. But I do want to just make sure we capture everything that we've heard in terms of our goals and objectives, and then the policy proposals that came from various city councilors, as well as some of our analysis and the impacts of those, and kind of just making sure how we ended up at the specific proposal that we're going to talk about. Next slide. And next, we can skip this one to get to. So these, from the docket item language, no surprise, the goals that we've been hearing about over the last 6 to 9 months is preserving the current housing stock, increasing access to attainable homes. I think that is kind of in the context of cost and size, and that when new development does occur, that it should be contextual or fit within the neighborhood. And none of that's new. I think what is new is this kind of diagram, in that we tried to map the level of impact, the level of analysis needed, as well as the level of outreach needed, the most being the top right quadrant, down to the least amount in the lower left quadrant, for any type of policy or zoning change to meet these different goals. So obviously the most extreme, if you want to preserve your housing, would be to put in a building moratorium, and then going down to the lower left, which we'll talk about, the facade build out ratio requirements or increased setbacks, and making sure that new development fits in. And again, what this gets at is with the understanding that the city of Newton is almost 100% single family and zoned for single family and 2-family development in terms of its lots. So if you start to make these changes, it's impacting, again, almost 100% of the city. Next slide. And so again, we're going to kind of go into these different goals and the policy pieces here, and the kind of implications. You go to the next slide. So the first one about preserving current housing stock, with those tools that could achieve that within that diagram, is it's essentially a building moratorium, reducing FAR, floor area ratio, which is the amount you can build on a piece of land, down extremely low, And the third possible tool is to increase the ability to adaptively reuse an existing building. And the impacts of these at kind of at a high level, really the first two, a building moratorium or FAR reduction, is that they're a major impact on property rights, a reduction in property rights. We believe across the board, these would very negatively impact the city's fiscal health, given previous conversations we've had about how revenue comes from and how growth fuels our city budget every year. And as well, when it comes to an FAR reduction, given the analysis we've done on tear downs, and that small homes on large lots are the homes that are the most susceptible to being torn down, if you truly wanted to stop those, the reduction would have to be so high that in effect it becomes a building moratorium. Adaptive reuse on the other side of that is essentially the kind of other side of the coin, is to allow homes to expand, existing homes to expand, or to renovate into multiple units. That we, again, acknowledge that's going to be an incentive to preserve Newton's larger homes. It's not going to be really an incentive to preserve the typical tear down, because again, that's a smaller home on a larger lot. So it's not that it will preserve housing stock, but it might not be preserving the housing stock that we're necessarily losing right now. Next slide. Access to attainable homes. So again, the adaptive reuse tool would help with this. The contextual subdivision that was talked about at the last meeting, and the expanded ADU allowance. These are the tools, not saying do this, don't do this, or just saying this is what was kind of presented and put out there. So allowing more units, particularly smaller ones on a piece of property, particularly smaller pieces of property, should be produce lower cost units. When it comes to the ADU allowance, if we can allow existing property owners to age in place in a way that frees up existing housing without tearing it down, it might be a win-win situation, where the existing home stays and smaller, more manageable homes for that aging population is made available. Next slide. When it comes to making sure the new development is contextual or fits within the neighborhood, these were the different tools put out there. New lot standards for new development, that requirement, a minor floor area reduction. What was happening in Lexington was put out there. The maximum facade build out along the street, and potentially increasing the setbacks. So the first two tools, I think, through analysis that Councilor Wright and Councilor Baker did a few years ago at this point, when looking at new lot standards, I think we can say that for the most part, it won't lead to smaller homes, and for the most part, it won't lead to homes that maybe feel smaller either. And we know it will disproportionately impact smaller lots, which again, smaller lots inherently, I think, can fit more contextual development. Smaller development can be, again, more affordable, or attainable, whatever that number may be, for Newton. So again, it might lead to slightly smaller homes, but again, it wouldn't stop those tear downs, because those homes already are very, very small, and the potential for development is significantly higher. So if you just reduce that a little bit, the desirability of Newton would still most likely lead to a tear down. And where we want to focus on here is this facade build out requirement, so that the building as it faces the street can be a maximum amount of the entire lot width. And we'll talk about increased setbacks as well. And so what that gets you to is something that feels smaller, looks smaller, but might not necessarily be smaller. Next slide.
Chair, can I ask a question?
Who's that? Councilor Kalis. Do you mind waiting until we get through the presentation and then come back?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, just want to.
So, thank you. And so this is where we, again, looking at the different goals that the council's presented, as well as the need or desire to do something quickly, is to focus in on the facade build out and potentially increase setbacks. We're really going to focus on facade build out, and we'll explain why in a second. In the short term, whereas in the long term, if you go to the next slide, if the committee or the council is so inclined, is to focus in on some of these other policy considerations that we think can achieve some of the other goals that have been laid out in front of us. Next slide. So now we're going to kind of dive in specifically to the facade ratio zoning tool, the requirement we're looking at. Next slide. And so why do we need a new tool? I know increased setbacks. If we're saying we want to kind of shrink the building as it appears from the street, why not just increase the setbacks? And first, let's just take a step back. I think why we're seeing wider, larger homes as appearing from the street is because of a trend in a desire of how people want to live, or how developers, I think people want to live, which is, I think you want large open living spaces that are oriented to the rear of the house, that open up to as large of a backyard as possible, or that there's a usable basement. Whereas, maybe there was a tuck under garage in the basement before. Now that basement is, a play space, another bedroom, a bathroom, a wine cellar, whatever that may be. So you want to push the garage up as far as possible. You want to push the house up as far as possible for the largest backyard. And those kind of market conditions are leading to what we've been seeing over the last many, many years. In addition, we have our garage ordinance requirements, which means you need to have a certain width to get a 2-car garage facing the front. So you need a certain width to do that. And then from a 2-family perspective, where you traditionally would have had, one unit above the other, that goes away. No one's building those anymore. They're all side-by-side townhomes, which leads to a longer width. And so looking at setbacks alone, we kind of came to the conclusion that it's not going to work unless you go really, really heavy, you really increase those setbacks, and that will then disproportionately impact those narrow lots, those smaller lots, which we don't want to do, because by design, those smaller lots are producing smaller development right off the bat. And so we think this facade build out, if we calibrate it correctly, it will give the appearance and the visual, it will give the contextual development, but it'll still give people their property rights fully. Next slide. And just, some examples, these are the case studies we've looked at before. This is 117, 119 Norwood. What was there before, a 2-family, one over the other, replaced by a 2-family side by side. You can see significantly bigger building, significantly builder facade, ratio as building as it relates to the size of the lot. Next slide. And just here, I just want to point out as, again, a good example why we think the facade build out ratio is the tool to use, is that this is a redevelopment of a 2-family home where the facade build out goes down, but the home size almost doubles. But it doesn't feel like it's doubling relative to the last one that we just saw. And obviously this one did it on its own, but we think if the tool's in place, then we can control that form a little bit better. And with that, to the next slide, I believe I'm turning it over to you, Teal.
Thank you, Zach. So before
Let me pause for a second. Councilor Kalis, are you okay continuing with this, or is there a question you want to ask about Zach's presentation at this point?
Yeah, this is referred to Zach's presentation. So, if I might, and I think he'll be able to answer these quite quickly. On page, I think it was 3, you went through all of the different options that we have. I just wonder, is there any type of fees or bonuses that could impact the way builders are building? Or is that not, that's not in there because it's not a zoning mechanism?
Well, I know the permit fees recently were all increased, to my knowledge.
Right, but are there other types of fees that maybe other cities and towns use, like a bonus for not tearing something down or not increasing the FAR, things like that?
I guess that would kind of fall into the adaptive reuse piece, right? Where we give more. So, I mean, again, do you allow them to do more units? Do you allow them to do more square footage? I think Newton has their de minimis rules, which allows, an existing building that has a certain nonconformity to extend that nonconformity and not require a special permit within certain limits. So there are some things that Newton has already. I don't know about other, at this scale.
Yeah, I think we'd have to have law involved in any conversation on fees. I don't know if we can charge fees just to discourage Something, yeah, I think it needs to be tied to the actual cost for that process. There are places that we still can add fees, and we've talked about and would like to add fees, such as demolition delay. We
Yep.
don't charge a fee for that review. But I don't know that there's a fee that's high enough that would stop someone, that we could legally charge that would stop someone from tearing something down.
Okay, I just wanted to throw it out there as something because it's not mentioned, and I know that we want to kind of just uncover any opportunities that might be out there. So that's the first one. So I'd ask that we maybe talk with legal just to firm up and to say, yeah, that's not really feasible. The second thing is, I think on page 7, maybe. It's where you mentioned the trend that's ongoing right now.
Yeah, it has the photos. Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the building trend is to build as much along the house. Right. So I recognize the trend, but what if we want to change the trend? So that's what I think this committee is actually talking about, is trying to change the trend that is to build as much along the front of the houses or the current building approach. And I think that's I don't know, it just jumped out at me as yes, there might be a trend, but as a committee, we're looking at this because we want to try to preserve different smaller houses, existing stock, and we want to buck the trend. And so I don't want to, just because that's what the trend is, I don't really want to play into it, I guess.
I appreciate that. I
There's
think
no question there. It's
it's a comment, and I think we can get into the discussion a little later, but I just want to ask if we try and make sure we get just questions related for clarification, if you don't mind at the moment, and then go to Util's presentation, then come back to conversation. But Councilor Wright, you have a question for clarification?
I'll wait. There is a bunch of clarification questions, but it was in the memo, and I'll wait until after
If you don't mind, Councilor Albright, are you okay waiting, or do you want
Just a
to?
quick question to put on the table.
Yeah.
Did you do, or will you do a fiscal analysis to see if the adaptive reuse, for example, or building smaller units on the same property is as fiscally advantageous to these developers as opposed to what they're doing now?
sure. We would do it if the committee decides that they want to explore adaptive
Okay,
reuse
so that's
as a
to be
tool.
decided. Okay, got it.
Okay, so, but are we ready to go to Util? All right.
A couple more.
Did I get any more hands up, or that didn't see? No. Okay.
Okay, so before we dive into the analysis, we first just wanted to understand what's on the ground relative to existing patterns of development around Newton. So going from left to right, I should mention these maps are all at the same scale, so you can really understand the difference relative to lot size, orientation, and building form and development when you go from single residence districts on the left to multi-residence districts on the right. And I think the examples we've chosen here are fairly typical for SR1s, SR2s, and MR1s. So on the left, in Oak Hill as an example, you can see very large lots. Buildings are generally oriented along the front lot line, and they have these nice deep backyards. In SR2, it's kind of an in-between example. You still have fairly large or medium-sized lots, decent-sized backyards. And when you get to MR1 in Newtonville, you can really understand that the lot sizes themselves are much smaller. Therefore, the frontages are also narrower, and the buildings themselves end up compensating for FAR by going deeper into the lot. So they've got smaller backyards. I wanted to point this out just because you'll notice as we start tinkering with different maximum facade build-out ratios, it forces the development to respond in different kinds of ways. So we wanted to note where that might be contextual relative to what's already happening in these neighborhoods. Next slide. So just going back to some earlier examples that we've presented here before, you'll notice in SR1, This example had fairly large setbacks. These are all examples of homes that we know have been torn down. That already had a decent sized facade build out ratio of 78%. The example in the middle had 16 feet and 21 feet setbacks respectively, 61% facade build out. And the example on the right was an MR2 with a 56% facade build out. So it was a fairly small development, as was the case for all of these. And when you go to the next slide, you can see that the construction that replaced it is, starting to get into that trend that Zach was mentioning of maxing out development within the side setbacks. So the facade build out ratios highlighted here at 81%, 69%, and 74% are all more or less greater than what came before them. And so this is what we're looking to address in studying maximum facade build out ratios to see if there's a Goldilocks solution to finding something that's just right for each type of zoning district. Next slide. So I know there's a lot on this slide, so I want to orient you first to what you're seeing because this kind of setup is going to repeat as we go from slide to slide. Thank you for moving. And so what we're doing here is we're going to be testing, we've made 3 general groupings. SR1 is on its own because we've noticed that SR1 lots tend to be very, very large. So we wanted to make sure that we were studying that separately. We looked at SR2 and SR3 as a combined kind of analysis because we thought that the lot sizes were pretty comparable for those. And likewise, MR1 and MR2 are their own separate grouping that we've studied. So starting with this example, going from left to right, we looked at what happens now, which means when there's no maximum facade build out and when, as we know, new development is able to build up into the side setbacks, what happens? And then we looked at starting from maximum facade build outs of 60%, which is the second column, and then looking at 50% in the third column and 40% on the fourth column. And then looking at the rows, we were trying to understand what happens in a more typical case. So looking at lot sizes that are more typical for this kind of zoning district. And then what's on the smaller side so we can understand where the pinch points are as we start to have lower maximum facade build out ratios. So in this case, we tested frontages of 110 feet and 100 feet because those were pretty typical for what we were seeing in SR1. And when you go to the next slide, you can see how that's really starting to get impacted, or we're starting to call it out here at least. So when you don't have a maximum facade build out, naturally, you're able to get pretty wide buildings, especially in SR1. So what that means is on a typical lot that might have a lot frontage of 110 feet, with the typical or the required setbacks of 12.5 feet, you can have a building that's potentially as wide as 85 feet. And that's pretty wide. And then when you look at what happens when you get a 60% maximum facade build out, you'll end up with a building width of 66 feet, which we found is actually more typical for SR1 development. So it's contextual with what's happening in the neighborhoods already. We looked at 50% and 40%. In the case of 50%, you end up with a building width of 55 feet. So it's certainly reduced from what's there now. It's a little bit smaller than what's typical for SR1 homes. And then 40% ends up with a building width of 44 feet, which you can see forces the building to go deeper into the lot. This is a little bit atypical for the typologies that you associate with the single resident districts, which tend to be a little bit more oriented toward the street. So you can see that this kind of forces the form to respond in an atypical way for SR1 homes. We looked at what happens on the smaller lots, and we think that 60% feels just about right, kind of like our Goldilocks solution here, because you end up with a building width of 60 feet. When you get to max facade build outs of 50% and 40%, those numbers decrease, so you get to a building width of 50 feet and 40 feet respectively. And so next we'll analyze the grouping of SR2 and SR3.
I'm sorry, just so people are clear, your sense of the number is small, but just so we all are clear, it's the 60% is your sort of golden mean here?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to be clear about it. All right, thank you.
And since from back here, I cannot see the percentages. 60 is the one with the dark rim around it. 50 is the one to its right, and 40 is the one to its right.
Yep, that's correct.
This is where folks at home have an advantage over us. And Counselor Wright especially, it's got a big screen.
Speaking of, my colleague Tim has his hand raised, so I imagine.
Oh, yeah, good.
Hello there, people in person. I just one important aspect of this rule set that we like is that the percentage that you deploy still has to fit within the setbacks. And so it gives the architect and the developer still a choice to slide the house left or right within the bands of blue that you see in the diagrams. And so the total percentage doesn't include the setbacks. The setbacks then are where you can play the game in terms of where you put that facade. And that, I think, is right relative to decisions that would be made about, contextual conditions, landscape features, those kinds of things. So we're always sliding those house forms to, in some cases, to the setback, sometimes not. But just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that the buildable area is within the setback still.
Okay, before we go on, is this question on?
Yes, I want to make sure I understand. So the maximum, the first one is the maximum build out. Is that right? The very first one?
So the first one has no maximum facade build out ratio.
So it's what's typically happens on a SR1 lot?
It's what can technically happen today, which is what we do see, happening, because there's nothing setting a limit on how wide a building can go.
And the 60% is 60% of that?
So the 60%, so in this example, we're using a frontage width of 110 feet. So the 60% is based on that total width. And it's applied, as Tim pointed out, within the zone that's within the blue zone.
So the percentages of the total width of the lot.
That's
I just wanted to make sure I
Yes.
had that. Okay, got it.
Yep.
Okay, Mr. Love, your hand is still up. Okay, you're all set.
Total width of the lot or total width of the lot less the setback?
Total width of the lot.
And I just one quick question. What's the ideal width of a house?
Counselor Wright?
I'm sorry, what's
Please recognize you.
oh, I'm sorry. What is the,
Recognize Counselor Wright, who has a question.
what is the, what width do most houses want? Or what's the minimum width that is needed for a typical house?
So that's a great question, and it really is going to depend on the typology. And so that's why we wanted to make the distinction between what is maybe more normal for single residence homes versus what is more normal or desirable for multi-residence homes. So for instance, the single residence homes are going to want to be a little bit wider. I was measuring some homes within the SR districts, and I think the 60 feet range and up is a bit more typical, more normal. So that's where, the maximum facade build out of 60%, we're noticing does result in those widths, which means you still get the nice, big, deep backyards, but your building widths are, reduced from what we're seeing happening in the new construction today. So it's kind of this nice middle ground. And then we'll get into, as we get to the multi-residence examples, what we think is appropriate to happen there. But there's a nice bit of flexibility that, a designer can have with this rule set to be able to try different typologies and be able to reconfigure the form in different ways.
We're going to come back to a conversation about this at the end, but I want to make sure we just get the clarification on. The Councilor Maliki, your hand is up for clarification. Welcome, by the way.
Thank you. I'm looking at the details here. It seems like every house ends up with the same gross square footage. So I'm having trouble seeing how this helps preserve existing homes.
It may not in the sense of I don't think the department is saying it would. It's basically saying, what is replacing those homes would look less imposing as a result.
Yeah, but if you're still ending up with 5,900 or 5,000 square foot homes, essentially, we're not doing anything to save existing homes and smaller homes.
On this model, I think it might be subject to correction by the department. I think that's correct, that this is a response to what gets built in its place.
But I thought the point of the docket item and this whole exercise was preservation of existing homes. So that's just me. Thank you.
But I think we just want to get through this presentation, then we can talk about where we go with it. Okay. You want to carry on?
Sure.
All right.
Okay, next slide. So next we'll be looking at SR2 and SR3 examples. As I mentioned earlier, SR2 and SR3 lots tend to be a little smaller than SR1 lots. So we looked at, in the typical condition, which is the top row, lots with a frontage of 95 feet. And on the bottom row, what we're calling narrow lots, those tested a frontage of 70 feet. And again, these were based on patterns that we got were more typical for SR2 and SR3. So when we go to the next slide, we're seeing when you max out buildings within the side setbacks, and again, side setbacks in SR2 and SR3 and in the multi-residence districts are smaller than SR1. These are 7.5 feet. You can get pretty wide buildings. So in a typical lot case, you might end up with the building as wide as 80 feet currently. That's what's possible today. Or a building with a 55 feet on a narrow lot. So when we look at playing out this maximum facade build out ratio in 60%, you can end up with the building width of 57 feet on a typical lot, or on a narrow lot, a building width of 42 feet. Those are certainly on the smaller side, but still viable. When we look at a maximum facade build out of 50%, those are reduced further. So when you get to the typical lot, you get a building width of 47.5 feet. And for the narrow lot, a building width of 35 feet, which is a bit challenging, I think, for this, single residence districts and the typologies we more commonly see built there. And then when you get to 40%, which is the column all the way on the right, it feels like it's overly punitive. You end up with buildings that seem overly narrow for single residence homes. So the example on the top right, you get a building width of 38 feet, and on the bottom, a building width of 28 feet, which is not in keeping with the pattern that we see of existing development around Newton. And you can see how it's really squeezing the building deeper into the lot, especially in the examples on the right. So again, we think that 60% kind of feels just right. You have the flexibility to move the building around within the lot minus the setbacks.
So just to be clear, in this context of SR2s and SR3s, you're still at the same 60% you were for SR1. Okay.
Yes.
Now, what we do with that, we don't know, but just so you understand your recommendation.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And actually 60% is kind of our recommendation in general for all these districts, because it seems to be resulting in development that we feel is contextual with the patterns on the ground of older homes. Okay. So when we go to the next slide, so this is MR1 and MR2 districts. So these tend to be much smaller lots with narrower frontages. So when we look at typical lots, we're testing here frontages of 80 feet. Narrow lots, in this case, we looked at frontages of 60 feet. And there's quite a few of those lots as well in the multi-residence district. So we really wanted to understand how these rules would play out, because we wanted to make sure that we're not suggesting something that might be too difficult to implement or build. So when we go to the next slide, you can see that when we're suggesting a max facade build out of 60% on a typical lot, you can end up with a building that's 48 feet wide. On a narrow lot, you can end up with a building that's 36 feet wide. When you go to 50%, again, it ends up being the narrow lots that are more challenged. So the narrow lot, which is the example on the bottom, is a building width of 30 feet. And when you go to the 40% examples on the right, for both of those, it ends up in buildings that are generally just impractical or undesirable to build, because they end up being 32 feet and on the top and 24 feet on the bottom, which is just way too narrow. So Councillor Wright had a question before about what kind of building widths might be typical for, or what would we want to see regarding building widths in this kind of development. And what's interesting about the multi-residence districts is we want to encourage flexibility and how a designer chooses to approach development on the site. And so 60% lets you make the choice of whether you want a side-by-side townhome, which we see happening a lot today. A lot of developers are making that choice, or whether you do a front to back kind of setup where you have access along the front lot line for one unit and access to the rear unit along the side. And so this allows for that flexibility. And when you go down to ratios as low as 50 or 40%, you end up getting shoehorned into only one type of development. And so we wanted to be able to have a ratio that lets you have that flexibility as a designer, as a developer, to make that choice. And, you know, to be able to place the development anywhere within the side setbacks on the lot, as long as it's conforming to that maximum facade build out. So when we go to the next slide.
Excuse me, before you do, was there a question on this slide, Councilor? Or do you- can you wait?
I'll wait because my question was on SR 2 and 3.
Okay.
So here, this example's just a little bit larger. So you can see how the 60% looks side by side with SR1 on the left, SR2, SR3 in the middle, and MR1, MR2 on the right. Again, these really just allow for more design flexibility to be able to put different types of configurations of a home within the lot minus the setbacks. So you can see how that's playing out here. SR1, that can give you a building width of 66 feet. In the middle, you can get a building width of around 57 feet. And on the right, a building width of 48 feet. And this is for what we're calling the more typical lots. So these are a little bit larger than the case that follows. So if we go to the next slide.
Oh, Mr. Love, thank you.
No, I just wanted to say that, you know, as we were testing frontage widths and then looking at the resulting building form relative to the context, we weren't out hunting to make the percentages all the same. It's kind of a happy accident at the end. And that has some regulatory satisfaction because it's the same rule, but it happens to make for contextual outcomes across all of these districts. So maybe there's a larger order to the universe in Newton or something, but we like that outcome.
I don't know what I can add to that after Tim said it. So yeah, 60% is our Goldilocks as the
But it makes sense because it's proportional to the width of the lot. So it proved, looking at the different housing typologies, that just the figure ground grain of the neighborhoods, that it works quite well. And but I do want to mention that you know, to one of the questions, this is only one of the potential tools because we're keeping the FAR the same in all of these cases. And it's back to the comment Zach made that you know, this is easier to implement in terms of process if we're not taking away value by reducing FAR. So I just this is not probably ultimately the full recommendation for the zoning, but just one tool that we spent some time thinking about.
I just want to make sure you're through with your presentation.
Yes, but I believe I pass it off now to planning again.
And I have just a couple more slides.
Okay, but before you do, are there questions on this before we go to Mel?
Yes, could we go back to the SR 2 and 3 slide?
This is Councilor Danbury.
Thank you. On these, are the garages, assuming that everyone has a garage, are the garages represented by the little blocks that are stuck on, or is that, or can the garage be anywhere in there?
They're kind of agnostic. I mean, certainly it could be an example on the left. It could be the small thing on the side. It could be within the front facade of any of these, or it could be accessed from the side.
Okay, and that gets to my real question, which is, it doesn't look like in these drawings that any of the garages are behind the house. In other words, kind of an L-shaped building with the garages tucked in the back. Is that because of some reason that you have, or is that because typically it's not popular with developers in new development to do that?
What we saw again from before is that if the garage starts to get pushed back, then it impacts your ability to have, again, open floor plan that leads to a large backyard. And obviously, traditionally, you had a detached garage in the back or tuck under garages. So I think there's a desirability that your basement is functional, right? So you don't want to do it, you don't want to give that over to the garage because you want to have a playroom and an extra bedroom and an office. And you don't want to push it into your backyard because you want to have, and you being, developers, this open floor plan that leads to as large of a backyard as you can, so you want to
Okay,
push it up.
That makes sense.
But there is some, so you could, and there are some incentives in the garage ordinance for doing something like that, and you're not restricted with, door widths or the percentage of your garage is set back or on the side. So you still could do that. I don't think we'll see a lot of that.
Okay.
It's also the cost of the driveway is least expensive if you've got the garage in the front.
Say that again.
The cost of the driveway is lower if you have the garage in the front versus a longer driveway, and you get into open space coverage and impervious surface if you've got a longer driveway.
Okay, good. Thank you. Those are good answers.
Sorry, Councilor Albright.
So my fiscal question, I guess, is gonna be the same answer. You don't know how attractive this is yet until you haven't studied the fiscal aspect.
Well, it doesn't seem like we're reducing the amount that you can build. Or no, we aren't reducing the amount that you can build. So I think the desirability of Newton, the flexibility within this, I think shouldn't, and on the last slide, we want to say we want to speak to more developers. We've spoken to some, we want to speak to developers on this proposal if you want us to move it forward. But we don't think that it should impact the prices. It just impacts the form, the kind of final form.
So the square footage of the 60% is equal to the square footage of the maximum
Yeah.
build out? Okay, that's good to know.
And this is why this is our sort of right now recommendation. At a previous meeting, we heard a desire to do something more quickly that doesn't involve sort of intensive outreach. So to keep the square footage constant, we don't need to go through the fiscal analysis and the extensive outreach to property owners that we would if we're impacting that. But it should look better from the street and fit in better.
I'm gonna let Mr. Love make a comment next, and then I'll go to Ms. Dane, who's asked a question from the planning board. And
Yeah,
Councilor-
I think that right. This won't affect underlying land value, but developers will have a little bit less flexibility, so they might, if you got more freedom to lay out a house, you're going to be happier. But the underlying land value won't be affected by this.
Ms. Dane, then I'll go back to Councilor Wright and then Councilor Denberg.
Thank you for the analysis. This is super interesting, and I completely agree from walking around communities that the width of the facade has a big impact on your perception of the bulk of a building. My question is how do you expect that this affects the orientation of houses, both single family and like two family or multifamily, in terms of if they're like the front of the house where you've got a door and just a perception of the front of a house is like oriented to the street versus to the side. Like there's a two family on Otis Street towards the corner with Walnut that's like you've just got a blank wall to Otis Street, and then the two townhouses are like facing the side of the lot. And I think that's common with two families. And I wonder if single families too, if they end up longer than they are now, like to what extent builders are using designs where that you lose the front facade, or if, I don't know, like how this would play out in terms of that issue.
Can I respond to that here online? I think it's a really good point, and I wonder if we might consider requiring the front doors of houses for single family and one of the two dwellings in a two-family to face the street. There are a lot of models of two-family buildings. A lot of them are renovations of former one-family buildings where there's a porch along the side that still has the short end facing the street, and you take that porch to get to a side door to the second unit. So there are some other form-based light rules that we could stir in maybe to make sure that you don't have a blind wall facing the street. I think it's a really good point.
Thank you. Councilor Wright.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Because I heard before was pretty soft.
Much better. Much better.
Okay. So I do like reducing the facade. And I'm leaning towards 60%, but I'm not totally set on it. But one thing besides reducing it, you're still set for most of them 7.5 feet from the neighbors, and that's the problem, or one of the problems. So, I mean, I would like to see an increase the side setbacks. And when we talked about before, you know, new lot standards, we're talking about tear downs, not for everything, but for tear downs. Now, the 60% I'd like to have as part of renovations, but the setbacks, you still got this towering building right on the lot line. And because most of the lots are not conforming, some houses on the other side of the lot line that's existing might be only 3 feet from the lot line. You know, my garage is 1.5 feet from the lot line. So being only 7.5 feet doesn't give that much breathing room. Thank you.
That's a part of the conversation I want to continue after we get the presentation. But Mr. Love, you want to add anything?
Yeah, we for didactic purposes pushed the houses to, in most cases in these illustrations, to one of the side lot lines, but an architect and a developer wouldn't make that choice. If there was a building just 5 feet away from one of the lot lines and they wanted to market a house or a two-family, they would probably center it between the setbacks. So I think I think very few developers would slide in the 60% scenario the house all the way to one of the lot lines, and unless there was a really good reason, contextual reason, either on the site or next door to do that. And so we thought it, again, in terms of expediency and not tinkering with the entire code, we at least our initial goal was to introduce this percent, but not go back and rethink all of the setbacks and a lot of the existing regs. So that was the reason. But I think these are to illustrate what 60% represents, but not where the buildings would land, if that helps.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilor Danberg, question?
Yeah, and just a quick question of Mr. Lamel. What is the, remind us what the current side, what is the current maximum facade build out percentage wise?
We do not have a requirement. It's just the
setbacks. Okay.
So it's within Councilor Oliver.
Great, thank you. I just want to clarify also, I think all of these, I think I heard you were saying that the resulting structure, right, the FAR that's listed there, I think we're looking at 4,200 on this particular, the 60% there, or that iteration of it. Is that contextual with the neighborhood or contextual with what developers are building?
So
Those numbers all seem pretty big to me as we kind of went through the several slides.
So the FAR is just based on what the zoning will allow currently. So it's just calibrated based on, the ratio relative to the lot size and maxed out.
Got it. So it's not contextual to, I thought I heard we were saying that those numbers were all contextual to the neighborhood, which I think was part of the setup for this, but that's not the case. It's within You're just using lot parameters to make the number. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the widths are architectural, not the building mass.
Got it.
Again, we didn't want to tinker with the FAR, at least in this study.
Okay. So, Mr. Lamel, do you want to finish your presentation?
Yes, and I'll try to be very brief. I think it gets to Dane's comment of kind of orientation. So a couple of years ago, we put forward a recommendation to update the definition of two-family. If the committee is supportive of instituting a facade build-out maximum, we very much feel and believe that the two-family definition needs to be updated as well. And the current definition, which you can see on the screen, really what I want to call out is what's highlighted and in bold is that dwelling units that are side by side must have a shared wall that extends the entire maximum height of the units. And Inspectional Services has interpreted this so that living space must touch living space for the entire height. If you go to the next slide, that is what led to the Chase Brayland example and the major site work. The current definition goes back to 2015. It was meant to address an issue, which is colloquially referred to as the linguini houses, as well as impacting front garages kind of being just, the facades being just garages, when you had a side-by-side two-family and there was really no door, it was just garages. We now have a garage ordinance in place that limits how much a garage can be of the facade. So that I think has been addressed separate and apart from the definition. And we know and we're seeing a lot of unintended consequences like Chase Brayland come from this definition. So I think if the committee and the council move forward with additional kind of controls, in this case, the facade build out, that the two-family definition really needs to be simplified. And to Ms. Dane's point is when because you can't have garages touching each other, if you were to orient your the units to the side instead of the front, and you have garages, which people want, you need to put living space between them. So they put the front doors or the doors or a hall between those, and they end up on the side. You can't have a unit with a front door facing the front and then the two garages for both units on the side, which I think from an appearance standpoint would look a lot better. It's just not allowed because of our definition. And I think if we were to change it, you could more easily, or particularly in the multi-residence district, if you have a two-family home or one's in the units in the front and one's in the back, you could orient the one in the front to the street and orient the one in the back to the side.
Okay.
And I'll just quickly, if you go to the next slide, I just share that with you here. This was the definition that was put forward and actually was approved by ZAP. It didn't make it through City Council in 2021, but it's just a building that contains two dwelling units. Accessory apartments are not considered a separate dwelling unit. That's a minor detail, but really we're getting rid of the definition having design controls. The design controls are in the zoning itself, and that it really is a very simplified definition.
Okay. Before we take questions, let me just make a comment for historical purposes. There are a few of us who remember the whole conversation around the Linguini ordinance, and I just want to say that reference here is not designed to prejudice pasta. It is really a reference to the fact that in the old days, people were saying their buildings were attached by really using a breezeway, a very limited amount of construction that became known as the Linguini link between the properties. And I think if we had a denser pasta, maybe it would have worked better, but we didn't have that. So we're, but that's what that comment comes from, and Mr. Love, before your time, but that's where it comes from. Okay, so let me just pause now. I want to get clarifications on that question and then go to the policy conversation about where we go with this. Councilor
Would you go back one slide to the Braylon? What happened here is a clear example of our in Newton not thinking of, for example, houses that are fronting on two streets that have, in this case, at least a 15-foot drop between street number 1 and street number 2. We forced this style house to be made because of our lack of foresight. And one change that I think we need to make is to accommodate for a house that, in a case like this, has a severe drop between one unit and the other unit. I understood that you could not vary the roof height. And I think that that falls out of requiring that we have 2 units back to back completely. So I think we need to change that so that we don't keep getting these.
Councilor Getz.
Yeah, the only other comment that I would make is that, when this came through historic, it was actually the Historic Commission that approved this plan. And there was no, zoning, in the room when this discussion was happening. So I don't know whether or not it locked in with the zoning as well.
They would still have to comply with zoning, it doesn't matter.
They don't have to comply with zoning. Yeah, they're just looking at the historic.
Right.
They don't, yeah.
So
They
I
get
remember-
sent back to historic if they're not in compliance with zoning.
All right, and the other question I had is somewhere in, at the table or at some point, I thought that when we had a property that abutted was on 2 streets,
That's true.
that each building was considered oriented towards that street and its zoning was considered, as individual buildings. So that doesn't occur.
No, that's still one building, and it has to be. Our zoning doesn't allow that to be 2 separate buildings. If our minimum lot size was smaller, you could have split that lot and had 2 buildings, one fronting Chase, one fronting Brayland. If they'd waited a little longer, the MRT zoning, because it doesn't have a minimum lot size, would have allowed them to split that and do one building up, at Chase and one at Brayland. But our current zoning would not.
So would you recommend, in terms of properties that have this differential, it's a through lot, is that what they're called? That there's some sort of criteria that kicks in? I'm trying to solve.
That's
the
what I'm
problem.
I think
suggesting.
just flexibility in our 2-family definition would do it. I mean, there's other things, if we reduce minimum lot size, you can look at splitting those lots, but I think the simplest thing is flexibility in the 2-family definition, because then you can adjust those 2 units so that they're accommodating that grade change.
If
And
we
there's
had
still one
allowed
building.
a change
Yeah.
in roof line.
And like not
That
having
would not
to
have had to happen.
have living space touching living space for the
Right.
full separation, then you could have brought that unit down to the street.
Something like they have to be touching with the exception of, bear in mind the difference between, street A and street B. You can have some kind of a differential.
I think that's correct. Let me just ask as a process matter now, Mr. Lamella, are you done? Okay, this conversation.
I can
Right?
just, if you go to the next slide, which is just the wrap up of just, I think if this is, you want us to push this forward, I think we can tease out the nuances around the facade build out ratio. I mean, I think 60% seems to be the Goldilocks, but there might be other components or elements to add to that to, again, deal with the nuance and the variability in Newton and make sure that we're accommodating a variety of design, good design, and then that we'll talk to builders and developers on this and refine and bring it back to you.
Okay, so let me suggest we take this conversation in 2 chunks, because I'd like to focus on the base idea, which is, again, not all of these other things, but just the question of how does the committee feel about the idea of a maximum amount of percentage. As we've seen, the 2-family piece seems to me a component, but a smaller component, because we're really talking about the single family districts dominantly for purposes of the base idea. The two-family definition is an iteration of it in a separate context, but is a different, range of exposure in a sense of
There's
impact.
two docket items. One has multi-residence and one.
Right,
single.
right, yeah. So I think it's important to not necessarily hold up the idea of the percentage. If we like it for the two-family, we still need to deal with the two-family piece as well, but it may not be inextricably linked to each other. So I just want to clarify that. So let's just see where the members of the committee are. Councilor Alden.
So it wasn't my question, but I thought that the two-family, if this all, you did it for SR1, SR2 and 3, and you did it for MR as well. So I think it applies, 60% applies across the
Oh,
board.
no, I know it does, but the two-family definition would be the MR piece,
Solving
not,
another
not for the others,
a related problem.
the related problems. But it's in other words, if you're doing this, you may have to do something else in the MRs in addition, but you might not have to do that in the SRs. Is that correct? No, you don't know yet. You're gonna look at this if we want to move forward on it, right? But just to try and make the distinction.
So my real question was, do we know, do we think, the premise that we built all this on is that we're trying to stop tear downs. And this is all based on, well, if you do tear it down, this is what you'll get. What impact will this have on people not tearing down?
Don't know. It may not be a lot. I think as we presented in the beginning, if you actually want to stop tear downs, you have to take drastic measures. We don't recommend those measures, and that's just not allowing demolition and new construction, or such a significant FAR increase that it's effectively a moratorium. We don't recommend that. We also would not be comfortable proposing anything drastic without really extensive outreach. We're talking 97% of the city, over 20,000 parcels. We did far, far more extensive outreach for less than 3% of the city. I don't think many homeowners are aware of these conversations right now. So if you actually want to stop homes from being torn down, you're talking extreme measures.
Yeah, no, I think I'm wondering, will this have any impact on a developer who might think about, could I add on to this house, what can I do to change this house to make it work within the 60% and still make it bigger? Is there anything there on that?
Well, my feeling is to the work, the analysis that UTL did early on about the other ordinances and regulations, I think those play a much bigger role to meet electrification, to meet stormwater, to meet all the various things. From the conversations that we've had with developers, it's just significantly easier and cheaper to
tear it down.
To start from scratch.
I think there's some of the other things like the height change, the retaining wall change may impact some of these decisions, or just decisions for builders to, work in Newton. We don't know yet, which is another reason why I think doing something relatively focused makes sense, because we have had ordinance changes related to single-family homes recently and still coming. So with the electrification, with the update, the specialized code, with trees and stormwater and retaining walls and how height is measured, we don't know the impact of all of this yet. So we think this is something we can layer on that isn't going to significantly throw off, the economics and, throw things totally off kilter, but will have a positive result in things feeling like they fit better in the neighborhood.
It will stop people, it will stop the McMansion.
Yeah.
It won't stop the McMansion, it'll make the McMansion less obvious.
Yes.
Yeah,
So-
there you go.
All right. I want to recognize Councilor Wright about the conversation, but let me just try and structure, if you don't mind, the where we are. we're basically just trying to see if we want the department and UTIL to carry forward with this idea and produce a version of it that we can be more specific about, as potentially bringing it to a zoning amendment. It's not an amendment, it's a concept at this point. But you could foresee an amendment that said that for every single family or two family house, it would be no more than 50% of the lot width, and that's a very simple amendment. But the question is it simple to implement, and what does it mean? And that's part of the next iteration. So I'd like to get a sense of the committee about where we want to go with this, but to make sure we answer the questions. There are other things we can do, and I'd like to talk about those separately. But right now, I'd like to get a sense of where we are with this. Councilor Wright on this, and I've got the answer.
Okay, just a few couple things. So I'd like to see a picture of what we tried to fix with our definition of two-family, the Linguini house or whatever. I just right now not having a good visualization on that, because we want to make sure if we change this definition that we won't get back to what we were trying to fix in the first place. The second thing is, I do like this idea of limiting it. And again, it sounds like 60%, but I'm not totally on board. I just need to look at it more because this is the first time that I've seen this data and information, so I didn't have a lot of time to digest it. You know, the question is on there are some very narrow lots. You know, what could possibly be done with that, or maybe they won't tear down because they can't build anything that's of substance. I'd like to get back though, before we go elsewhere, is, you know, what we were trying to do is not to stop tear downs, but to reduce tear downs, which is kind of two totally different things. And one of the things, and but then I have other questions, which I'll come back to later, is I did ask, Lexington has a sliding scale of FAR reduction, and I wanted to know how that is working for them, and if it's helping in this. And also, I think most of these tear downs, and maybe planning will have an idea, homeowners that are living in their house, I think there's very few of them that leave, tear down, and rebuild. I think most of the tear downs are new owners, new developers. You know, it's not the present owner that's in there. Thank you.
And I think your question is reasonable, but it's, let me just ask us if we can just get clarity about whether to proceed forward on this concept. So I want to recognize Councilor Guest and go back to Councilor Danberg and the Vice Chair.
Thank you. The one piece that's, I'm assuming that this is up to 60%, so that they could flux up to 60. The only piece that's a little concerning is some of the 60s homes that were one of the tear downs was that, you know, and it's actually, that's the building typology. You know, it's actually low and it's meant to sit on the lot that way. So that's the only one that I'm, you know, sort of in my head right now thinking is gonna be a problem.
Yeah, we talked about that a bit too, and that's something I think if we move forward with this, we can take a closer look at, because maybe it's different for 1.5 stories, right? Most of those are, you know, 1.5 stories versus the 2.5 stories. Where you're seeing sort of the dramatic change is when you had that low sort of mid-century, but wide home go now to 2.5 stories, really more like 3.5 when you account for all the grade manipulation and whatnot that we've addressed. But it's that difference in height that makes that feel a lot more massive. So I think a lot of people probably don't have a problem with the 1.5 story taking up a larger percentage of the lot. So I think that's something we can accommodate.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to stay narrow.
Do you want to say, I want to get a sense, you want the committee to go forward with it?
Absolutely,
Right.
but it's not solving the problem.
It's not solving all problems, or it's not solving a tear down. It is making a replacement structure less obnoxious. Okay, I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. But it is a relatively simple, low value impact solution if it can be crafted and worked with further analysis. And I'm just trying to get a sense of the committee whether you'd like the department utility to carry forward with this and bring it back to us in the next iteration. So now, Councilor Danbury.
A question for either Mr. Lamel or Ms. Kyra. Do we have any idea about how many of those, I think you said this would impact around 20,000 units. What percentage of those units would be thrown into non-compliance, non-conformity really? So that those units would now have to go for a special permit if they wanted to do certain things.
First.
I don't know about the percentage, but as far as the special permit, that would be if they were increasing the non-conformity. So if they were doing something else on the home, so let's say they are at, we make it 60% and they're at 70%. If they wanted to make their house wider and add on to that front facade, yes, they would need a special permit because they're increasing that non-conformity. If they wanted to add on to the back, if they hadn't maxed out height and they wanted to go up, if they wanted to do other things, they wouldn't need a special permit as long as they're complying with the applicable zoning rules.
Okay, that's helpful because I think we don't want to throw a lot of people into a situation where if they want to do something like add a family room with a bedroom over on the second floor, that they would be required to go for a special permit.
And I'll just say, I don't know the percentage either, but I think to Councilor Getz's point, if we made to say single-story buildings and 1.5-story buildings do not have a maximum requirement.
Okay.
I imagine the ones that are longer than 60% are the ranches, the split levels,
Yeah.
the ones that are in the 1.5 story range already.
Okay, thanks.
People aren't
And I-
building those.
No,
They're
no,
not.
no.
And I think if somebody decides to replace a 2-story structure with a 1.5-story structure, we would all
Great.
rejoice, right? It's not likely.
Question.
Yeah. Vice Chair, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. So the concept itself, I think we should take forward. I do want to make sure, however, that, because I heard quite a few different comments being made, and I want to see proof behind them, because a couple of them struck me really sideways. Number one, someone said, if we go down this route and we go for the 60%, builders aren't going to be likely to impinge on the side setbacks. I'm going to throw a flag on that one. I can't tell you how many times I've pointed out, oh my God, why are you you're building a special permit. You're asking for, all these different relief and you're going into the side setback. Please stop it. So I would like to see somebody say, oh, these side setbacks either, in my opinion, we need to continue studying these, because I don't see that kind of behavior out of the entire development community, because if they can, they will. And I think we have seen them, they might not go end to end with the building structure, makes perfect sense. The driveways, patios, outbuildings, things of that nature tend to get added on to the sides and the back frequently. And again, I don't want to debate that point here, to your point. I don't want to exacerbate the challenge of kind of keep these cats. So let's keep looking, keep moving forward. I also don't want us to just now narrow and choose 60%. I want us to keep looking at what about the 55 or whatever the next one was? Because as much as I understand how we have increased the burden on new development through electrification and so on and so forth, I feel like we're still trying to protect for the developer and the designer and not the abutters here. We need to do some of that. I understand that, but I still want to see us keep looking to the sides. I don't want us to get too narrow on 60%. And with that, I'm happy to proceed with this.
Okay, so let me just see it. I think that I'm hearing that there's interest in having further review of this idea. Again, it's not going to necessarily, but stipulate that it's unlikely to affect teardowns per se. but it may affect the replacement of tear downs. And replacement in a way that will make it less intrusive into the neighborhood context in which it is found. But I'm hearing that, if I can speak what I'm hearing from members of the committee, we'd like to have the department and Mr. Love and the UTIL carry forward and bring back to us at the next meeting if possible. Because we've got a month really between now and then. Now it's the holiday too, so I don't want to have people spoil their holiday doing this kind of analysis. But I think you get enough signals from the community, from the group, to bring us back to the next iteration. It may take another iteration beyond that, but I would like to see that. And then the question of how the two-family is adjusted, I think, is a piece of the puzzle, but a part of the puzzle. And I would like not necessarily to have that be the deciding factor one way or another, because I think the idea in general has appeal. But before we go to that decision, I want to recognize several colleagues and then come back to Ms. Danny. So first, let me recognize our Councilor Lipoff, and then I'll go to Councilor Kalis, and then Ms. Danny. Councilor Lipoff.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So Councilor Wright, you're talking to a guy who moved out of his house for 14 months and redeveloped and moved back in. I know many people who do that, so I'm not sure what that meant. But I will tell you the street that you had up there for SR1, that's the street I live on. And the average lot size is 25,000 square feet. And the homes, although they're called McMansions, if you drive on the street, you will see that the home fits on the lot. The homes fit on the lot. And that is the focus that I endorse the planning department in their work tonight. Because to come up with a percentage of the frontage that's reasonable, to deal with the massing from the streetscape, to deal with the character of each of our neighborhoods, which is what I thought that pattern book, which we spent a fortune on, was supposed to do and help us and steer us, and maybe it still will be useful. And I understand, Mr. Love, that the 60% looks like it's working everywhere, and I'm perfectly happy with running that. And I agree with Councillor Oliver that maybe we do look left and right of that and see what works. I quickly did on my walk with the dog about 10 minutes ago when my camera was off, and paced out a bunch of the homes on my street. And I think that 60% is making some sense to me. When I hear from other councilors that this does nothing to prevent tear downs, I was very happy to hear from planning that a moratorium and taking away the rights and the values of people's homes in Newton, to quote Ms. Kyra or Mr. Lamel, we need to let people know what this committee is talking about, because they may or may not be on board or happy with it. This just isn't about developers. This is about our customers as well, which is every citizen in this city. This is kind of, I'm having Groundhog Day feelings about what I'm saying as compared to the last council and what happened when fear was sown throughout the city that zoning and planning was going to destroy our city. There's all different ways to do that. And that's why I'm one that is more inclined to be hands off and not take the rights of our citizens away, but with good zoning, with potentially no more than 60% frontage of the frontage to be the facade. Maybe we can work on the massing of buildings, and size may come down a little bit, but I'll caution you. If you take a 4,500 square foot home in Newton, a new home that sells for $3.5 million, and you make that a 2,400 square foot brand new redeveloped home on that lot, that home's going to be worth $2.5 million. And we have done nothing to create any more naturally affordable housing. And even if we preserve our homes and take away the rights of our citizens to add to homes or redevelop their homes. Those homes are still not going to be naturally affordable. So I think we have to focus on what we're trying to do here. And this first step with the 60% and where the planning department is coming from, I can endorse that as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Kalis, a member of the committee?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Councilor Lipoff that we need to focus. I'm a little bit disturbed because the docket item is all about preservation of existing homes. And where we're going now, it doesn't even reflect the docket item. So to me, it needs to be redocketed as a different item because we're talking about not the preservation of existing homes, but about how we're going to rebuild homes. And that's a whole different conversation.
That's a fair point, Councilor Kalis. I guess there is it's arising out of these docket items, and I think that ultimately we may create something in addition, but I think that the scope of what we've been doing has been trying to figure out not just the preservation was in line of two objectives, one to preserve them, but also to try and deal with that when they're torn down, the replacements are less obnoxious.
Well, then I would say let's NAN or dispose of the existing ones and docket new items because we have to make sure the public knows what we're talking about.
That's a fair point, but Councilor Albright has a response.
So the docket item that we docketed on the MR talked about regulating the resulting homes. So it's in that second docket item, Councilor Kalis.
Oh, okay. Maybe I was looking at the first one then.
Well, the first one is, I think, there are two docket items we're carrying simultaneously. Ms. Dane, and then I want to just get back and see if we can move forward. Ms. Dane?
Sure, thank you. I guess I was just thinking about how this affects development of ADUs or how that like sort of fits into the puzzle for single
Can you
families.
come a little louder or a little closer? I can't.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering about how development of ADUs would be affected by this regulation. And then I just also, on the theme of what I was talking about before, I just keep thinking about the entrances. And to me, the example of the two-family that got redeveloped from the stacked two-family from the 1920s or older to the side-by-side townhouses. Aesthetically, like the old 1920s two families that are stacked are a lot more attractive than these wide ones. But between having like a townhouse hidden in the back and two that are facing the street, as long as this is like the development type of the neighborhood, I just think of kids trick-or-treating and having front-face doors, or kids going to play dates with their friends and walking down the street and going to a front door that's facing the front versus like something hidden in the back where we have these regulations forcing that kind of development of hiding homes. I like front-facing, even if it's going to be like a lot wider and a little more obnoxious in size than our traditional development from the 1920s. So I just like keep that in mind of like the unintended consequences of narrowing buildings, and then thinking how ADU development fits into this puzzle now that that's being like promoted in the state, and hopefully price of construction will come down on it.
All right, let's see if we can.
So I wasn't going to speak about side-facing houses, but I think I will anyway. Because I don't object to side-facing houses. We have quite a few of them in Newton, actually, that where the lot is narrow-ish, and so they've accommodated that by having a side entrance. And as long as it's designed nicely, it works very well. And we do have a lot of single-family attached homes in Newtonville, especially on Otis Street, where the houses do go back, and they are off a driveway or a walkway that goes back. So I wouldn't want to limit ourselves to requiring front-facing houses, because there's a lot more to be gained by taking advantage of the deep lots.
Okay, all right, I want to bring it into committee, and unless someone has anything new to add, I would like to move it along. Councilor Lipoff, you had your hand up. Are you done, or is that just
Just quickly, in agreement with Counselor Albright, and just to remind everybody, and planning will probably back me up, is that there's always an exception to the rule, and based on topography and frontage and other characteristics of lots, side facing, there may be the ultimate way to develop a home that doesn't completely fit into this, and we should allow, and I guess maybe that's just by special permit, but we should allow some flexibility because the best development may not always fit into what we do. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that that's been our pattern, which is to set a sort of a baseline as of right, and then in the appropriate situations, figure out if there's a special permit exception, but rather than send people into a variance. But I think that I take it as a sense of the committee and the comments that we'd like to pursue this going forward. At least have the committee, the department and the consultant come back to us with the next iteration, taking the comments and the questions that have been made. Is that a fair summary of where we are? If that's the case, then I would entertain a motion to hold the items.
Happy to move hold.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Christmas, wonderful.
Oh, wait. Are we done talking about preserving existing homes? Because I have a whole bunch of questions on the memo and want some clarifications in
That's
that.
fair enough. If you want to do that, and we'll hold the motion to hold. But I think we are clear, at least, that there's a sense of the committee to carry forward with this idea. I didn't mean to cut off your conversation, Councilor Wright. And I should just indicate, while I appreciate the comments that Ms. Kyra has indicated, historically, this committee and the council have adjusted significant amounts of opportunity in the city for people to build. The whole FAR itself was created by the council a number of years ago, and it changed the values of properties, but it produced a significant benefit in the process of doing that. So it doesn't mean we don't do outreach, but I just want to point out that the policy choice of what to do is ultimately a legislative one and not a planning one. So with that, Councilor Wright.
Thank you. So this is the planning memo, and talking about the goals. So like the first goals, again, which I kind of said before, is I thought we are not actually trying to stop tear downs, but to reduce them. And so one of the questions I asked in one of the other meetings is the sliding scale FAR, and that's only for tear downs. And Lexington is doing this. And I was wondering if they have reached out to Lexington and what have they said about their reducing or the sliding scale reduction of FAR.
You have any response, Mr. Lerman?
Sure. So the Lexington example, and we shared this, I think, in the spring, was brought on by a citizens petition. It wasn't brought on by the planning department, and it was a reduction, I think, of between 5 and 20%, depending on the lot size. The smaller lots have less of a reduction for new development, and the larger lots have potentially up to a 20% FAR reduction. It was brought into effect at the beginning of this year, so it's only been a year. And I think, as you may remember, the reduction is still not. There are still very large buildings allowed. The small lots still allow, multi-thousand. I don't have it off the top of my head, and the larger lots allow, 7, 8, 1,000 square foot buildings. And so I think similar to Newton, Lexington is a very desirable place to live. I spoke to the planning director there. I spoke to someone in the assessing department. It doesn't seem like, again, I think it was anecdotal. They didn't do a deep analysis that sales and sales leading to teardowns have slowed down because of that reduction. Again, there was no analysis done on it, really. It was a citizens petition brought forward fairly quickly that really wasn't vetted. And so it seems that the development community is responding. Again, I'm waiting for some information back from the assessing department. If sales maybe are at a lower price point, maybe But again, they're still resulting in tear downs, it seems, given the high desirability of a place like Lexington, and the FAR that is allowed is fairly substantial still.
And I think, just if I could add on for a second, we did put a minor FAR reduction in sort of the like longer term bucket. Not that, we're not saying right now we shouldn't do that, but that would need more study. Our recommendation would be to pair that with something like adaptive reuse or expanded ADU allowance. But, you know, if the committee wants to move forward with that, you know, I think we're comfortable doing more analysis and more study, but we were responding to a desire to do something relatively quick.
Okay. And I don't think, like you have said too, it's not one thing that's going to solve this problem. It's a multiple things I think would need to be done. And changing the setbacks and the FAR I think would help, but it also will help what's being built there, just like the 60%, you know, facade type of thing. Because if you take a look at what's being built, a lot of houses are within 5 feet of the FAR. I mean, they just play it sometimes within 1 foot of the FAR. So, which is massive for a lot of these lots. So I think I'd like to look at that more, but yeah, you're thinking that this isn't a quick fix though.
I think what I'm hearing is that those are second order analysis, and if we want to try and take advantage of a window, and I'm conscious for members of the committee that, you know, we're at the end of the year, we're going to start the beginning of the year to pull something together and get it done before budget hits us. It's only 3 months before we get into budget season, and then the committee's window of opportunity begins to diminish. So my hope is that, consistent with what we've done before, that if we can move something forward in the short term that's going to provide some relief to the kinds of concerns that have been addressed, that will be an advantage. That doesn't foreclose us from going down other roads that the department has indicated we could pursue, but I'd rather hold that discussion to another time. I'd really like to move us forward on this item tonight and see where we go with that.
So one of the things, this is basically what we're looking at, is just changing what's going to be built there. So if that's the case, I don't understand why for tear downs we can't use new lot standards, which is big as the side setbacks.
A question that I think the department, Ms. Cover, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just want to respond specifically to the new lot aspect. I think there could be, you know, I think we could look at setbacks. We started to and did some analysis there and found you really need much more analysis to make sure you're not making those narrow lots unbuildable, and they're not the problem we're trying to solve. It's the wider lots that are the problem. However, I want to sort of move away from the focus on applying new lot standards but thinking more about what are appropriate setbacks. Because new lot standards come with a whole host of different dimensional controls that are predicated on it being a larger lot, because they only kick in when you're creating a lot. So right now they only apply when you're creating a new lot. That lot has to meet the minimum lot size and minimum frontage of new lot standards, which then make it possible to meet the new lot setbacks, the new lot open space, lot coverage, all of those things. To apply those to smaller lots, I think you're going to make some of those really unbuildable, and you're going to be disproportionately affecting smaller lots with that.
But part of the thing is to reduce the tear down. So if that lot becomes unbuildable, then they would leave the house that's on and maybe make renovations or add on, which would have the old lot standards.
I mean, if you want to make smaller lots unbuildable, but you're still going to see the big homes happening on larger lots. Like, I don't think it's fixing the problem. I think there could be an avenue for looking at setbacks and sort of calibrating those correctly, because that seems to be most of the concern, is how close the house is to the neighbor. This facade will get at that to a degree, because it's going to make it so you can't build out to the setbacks. So you can't build out to both sides. And like Mr. Love said, you're more likely to center that unless there's a strong design reason not to, because the people living in that new house don't want to be that close to their neighbors either. But I don't think we should apply wholesale new lot standards to lots that don't meet the minimum lot size for new lots.
So, Councilor Wright, if the question I think may be phrased, is there further analysis that may be heard, not tonight, but of what appropriate setbacks adjustments ought to be considered, even if they're not new lot setbacks, but there may be adjustments, as I hear Ms. Kyra indicating that we could move and look at that might have some impact on not only what's built, but maybe impact tear downs as well, although we can't tell that right now, as I hear it. Mr. Love, you had your hand up, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I know you're trying to get to the next item in your agenda, but I think the other tools that have been discussed, some reductions in FAR, other things that deal with the tear downs themselves, incentives for keeping existing structures and doing additions instead, work within the percent frontage tool. So the percent frontage tool, we think, pairs up with a lot of those other regulations that will be considered later. They're not mutually exclusive. And so that's why we that's also why we thought it was a good kind of early revision to consider, because those other things would work with it, if that makes sense.
So I'm hearing it doesn't preclude other intervention, right? Okay, I want to try and Councilor.
This is related to this, so that the AD, can we put the ADU part of your chart into the ADU discussion? Because is that
That's
what
up
you
to
had in mind?
the committee. We weren't.
So there's gonna be an ADU discussion coming up.
Yes.
And ADU was one of the relatively short term, but not long term. It was a midterm, maybe.
Yeah, but we're going to get to that in some way, in one way or another. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure it doesn't, the part of the ADU discussion that could have an impact on what we're talking about in these two docket items that are.
I think we've got a collateral item that will do that, or a parallel item, but let's see where that goes. But your fair point. Okay, so I've held off the motion to hold, which Councilor Krinsman had moved, and then I asked him to hold it before we voted it to get everybody's comments. Any further comment on just the with the understanding that the item is held, both items are held, that we're at least asking the department and UTIL to come back with the next iteration of the percentage of flat frontage adjustment to our zoning. Fair summary? Okay, and there may be an impact on two-family definition in the process, but we want to make sure that we sort that out, but not let that decide the question entirely. At least that's my preliminary sense. Okay, we agree to that. Then I would entertain the motion to hold. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you very much. Mr. Love, thank you very much for attending. We try and do these conversations on nights when you can come. Now, the next zoning meeting, though, I think is actually a Monday, in January, where we hope to have this conversation again. Is there a time of night that works for you? If Monday is, are you teaching that night?
I'm teaching on Monday evenings. That's the issue. So I will coordinate with the planning team and with you, Chair, to make everybody happy.
I mean, we're not averse to flipping the order. We tried to put this on first tonight because you were available and we thought you might.
Yeah.
Our wonderful planning staff are sort of captives, notwithstanding, but they've got other items, but.
Yeah, we'll coordinate, but thanks for the consideration.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Have a good holiday, both of you. We appreciate your time. Okay, let's go on to the next item, which is, this is this discussion of possible amendments. This is retaining walls. Okay.
Yes. Give me 1
We
second.
get to play again. This is, I'm talking about a meeting that's stranger battery. Right?
I think it's also a laptop problem, but.
I'm going to suggest we've been at this for 2 hours. We just take a brief bio break for 2 minutes. Everybody okay with that? We'll come back. Go at it. All right.
Hey. Better you than me, man. Hold on a second. Let me just make sure I'm.
Relax the stringent prescriptive.
Counselor Danberg.
Oh, yes. So many things.
Okay. Let's resume.
Just trying to plant some ideas.
extracurricular lobbying is permitted outside of the.
When it's on your own.
No. All right. Okay, the next item is, this is a discussion of possible amendments to 5.4.2. This is, the retaining wall regulations in, the BC districts, basically. So this is a repeat performance, but, with an adjustment. So the department is prepared to go ahead. Who's doing this one? You are, Ms. Cara, 18.
Yes, and that is correct. This is a repeat. We presented this at a prior meeting. Also, just want to clarify the actual docket language talks about section 5. That was initially our proposal, was to address this where we regulate retaining walls for all properties and to address it for all multifamily. We have since narrowed that scope sort of multiple times now. So it really is only applying in section 9, which is the Village Center Overlay District, just to clarify that. So just to quickly recap, the VCOD requires a special permit for all retaining walls over 4 feet, as does the rest of the city at the, as of this past summer. When we submitted our zoning to the state for compliance with the MBTA communities law, we got back from them that this was an issue. The exact language was that this requirement could require a special permit for many development proposals, as retaining walls are often part of routine site work for multifamily housing. This requirement must be removed in order for the zoning to allow multifamily housing as of right. So they started out saying you have to remove this requirement. We've managed to sort of negotiate that down to focus on where we think it's most impactful, which is really around parking and providing parking. So just to show some examples, most multifamily buildings have parking that is located within the building or under the building. And to get to those garages, you end up needing some form of retaining wall. Now, these tend to be very small at the street, and then they increase in height to get down to the garage. From the conversations we've had in this committee, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of concern with this sort of retaining wall. It's also more desirable that we have parking inside the building or underneath the building. I think that's generally, from a design perspective, what we prefer to see. Previously, what we proposed was, and this was with working with staff at the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, which are the ones who are overseeing compliance with the MBTA communities law, or EOHLC. We proposed an exemption for walls when they're enabling access to parking or loading facilities. Now, what we heard was from the committee were concerns that could this be exploited? That going into the underground garage isn't really a concern, but could someone do something extreme on the property and say it was for parking and put a parking stall next to it? We didn't think that was likely or would be interpreted by the Commissioner of Inspectional Services as enabling parking, but we heard the concerns and went back to the state to see if we could narrow this further. So we have an updated proposal, and this gets a little more complicated, but I think this is a good solution in sort of balancing the concerns with ensuring that the housing can still be built by right. So our updated proposal exempts retaining walls from needing a special permit over 4 feet when they're enabling access to parking or loading that is located entirely inside of or underneath the building. So that gets you your underground garage. Now, we also need to make sure this alone was not acceptable to the state. So we first tried this language, was not acceptable as there are going to be scenarios where there may be surface parking, particularly in the MRT district. We're not expecting, and in adaptive reuse, we're not expecting many underground garages. The footprint is so limited. You can only do 4 units for new construction. Adaptive reuse, you have to keep the the existing house, you're probably not putting an underground garage. You're probably having some surface parking. Other regulations are sort of forcing that parking to the rear, rather than in front of the house. So we need to make sure if there's some site work that needs to be done to get enough of a flat spot for parking that can still happen. So what we came up with, working closely with the state, was that when retaining walls are enabling access to surface parking, that is necessary to meet and accommodates only the minimum number of spaces required. That they may exceed 4 feet in height, but may not exceed 10 feet in height, except by special permit. So this means, because I think MRT is probably the most likely scenario for this. VC2, VC3, 1, these are built out sites. Now they're pretty flat, they're mostly paved already. You're probably not doing significant site work that's going to need retaining walls on the site, other than to get into the underground garage. And you're most likely providing parking in the building. And MRT, where we think this provision will most likely come into play, you have a minimum parking requirement of 1 space per unit in new construction and 0.5 space per unit in adaptive reuse. So you have a minimum of 3 spaces to 4 spaces in a new construction, because you can do 3 or 4 units, or in adaptive reuse, 2 spaces to 3 spaces, because you can go up to 6 units. So it's not many spaces, so it shouldn't require significant site work. If you choose to provide more parking above the minimum, which would require more site work, those retaining walls would not be exempt and would need a special permit to exceed the 4 feet. So we think this is a good sort of middle ground and a good sort of compromise solution. And this would be acceptable to the state and would bring us into compliance. So this is our recommendation, is moving forward with this language.
Thank you very much. Questions from the committee, and can you close the?
Yeah, sorry.
Because I wanted to see the hands that are raised.
Can I just make one?
Oh, yes.
Additional comment? And maybe
Mr. Lamel?
Kyrie, you want to make this about how this interplays with how we measure height.
Oh, yeah.
So I just want to, the allowance for parking to meet the minimum parking of the up to 10 feet by special permit might sound a little bit scary, up to 10 feet. However, like how we measure height is a matter of from the original grade. So again, the incentive right now typically to raise the grade is relating to sinking a basement and becoming an upper stories. That doesn't work here because again, the definition for how we measure height has changed.
That's correct. And the other factor is one of the incentives we see in the single and 2 family that we were for doing that manipulation that we were addressing with the change in how we measure height was for the FAR not to count for the basement. So you've got to sink it enough so that it's not counting. The Village Center Overlay District does not have FAR, or regulating footprint and height. So there is no incentive to sort of mound up and sink a basement other than high water or things like that. But in that case, as Mr. Lamel said, the change in how we measure height will capture things so that you can't do significant grading and still meet the height requirement.
Okay. All right, you done? Okay, just comments, questions from the committee. Councilor Guest?
No.
And then Councilor Wright.
Okay, thank you. The 10 feet does seem excessive, just in terms of the topography. I'm mostly concerned about the consent, just in terms of the amount of grade that's right there with your MRT zone, just because of it's quite a significant grade change there. But would it be, in terms of our enabling access to surface parking, is that something that's actually going to be disqualifying? So if in fact they're not accessing parking, then they're ruled out, they're not able to then put in a retaining wall.
So they would still be able to go up to 4 feet.
Yeah.
But if the retaining wall is for other site work and not to accommodate the parking, then they would need a special permit to exceed 4 feet.
Okay. And then how did you land on the 10 feet? I mean, I didn't know if it would, I would want to relate it to the grade, you know,
So-
the existing grade.
Did look at the
Somewhere.
grades, and there are some, as you pointed out, some MRT sites that have a good bit of grade change. We need to sort of do something that is going to ensure that all of those sites can be developed by right. And because we're not allowing the parking in the front, we want to make sure you can get a driveway back and get a bit of a flat space. It's not a sort of exact science, but did look at some of the, you know, over the sort of minimum area you're gonna need for those parking spaces, the 9 by 19 spaces and the 2 to 4 spaces that are gonna be necessary. Looked at some of the steeper sites and where the parking is likely gonna be located and what the existing topography looks like, you know, how much is that raising or dropping over that where you're gonna need for that parking pad. And we think 10 feet will accommodate all of those. I think those are gonna be more the exception. I don't think many will need to go to 10 feet. Retaining walls are also incredibly expensive. So you're gonna do the minimum you need to meet the parking requirement. So that was how we came up with that.
Yeah, and then just lastly, if in fact this turns out to be a problem, you know, in terms of the amount of grade shift, is HLC, you know, willing to, you know, are we committed to this? Is it the kind of thing that we could revise if we needed to?
I mean, we can revise anything. We'd have to work with them again. They have, I will say they've been very willing to work with us. You saw their original language, which was remove this entirely. I think we've come a long way from that, to get something that they're willing to try, and keep an eye on. From their perspective, they also want to make sure it doesn't, they want to keep an eye on it and make sure it doesn't become a problem in preventing housing from being built. So I think we're trying to find that right balance where they're comfortable in that it's not going to stop housing and we're comfortable that it's not going to lead to, you know, situations we really don't want to see. So either way, we're going to be tracking and keeping a close eye on things. And if we need to come back and revisit it, we'll just, again, need to work closely with the folks at the state.
Councilor Wright and then Councilor Bamber.
Thank you. First, I want to point out in the VCOD where state law requires that Newton allows for multifamily housing to be built by.
Closer to the mic, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is this any better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So we're meeting the VCOD, which requires Newton to provide multifamily housing to be built fully by right. We've done that. It doesn't state that we have to allow the developer to manipulate the lot to maximize his housing. They get what they buy for. If you have a lot that has a slope, maybe it can't take as much housing that you'd like. I understand about the underground parking and I'm fully supportive to allow the retaining walls more than 4 feet, but I don't think we should be doing it in MRT more than 4 feet. The other thing, a statement you said, retaining walls greater than 4 feet are often part of routine site work for multifamily housing. When I look on like Trio and Austin Street, besides the underground parking, I'm not seeing retaining walls more than 4 feet. So I don't see how that is normal or routine. Can you address that?
So that statement came from the state, not from us. But I think they were thinking of the retaining walls such as Trio and Austin Street that go to underground parking as one component. The problem is we also need the MRT area to meet our minimum compliance, a minimum number of units. And they already had concerns with how restrictive the footprint is. So I don't think in the MRT, it's as much of, this is very different than your single family zones where you say, okay, you just can't build this big. We don't need to let you do the retaining wall. You just can't build this big. You bought a sloped lot. In the MRT, we're only, that 1,500 square foot footprint just barely makes 3 to 4 units work. And we have to allow at least 3 for it to be considered multifamily. So it's not a matter of just build something smaller and don't do the site work, because then it just doesn't work at all. They already had concerns with the size of the building and would prefer to see a larger footprint. If we don't allow some site work to accommodate the parking, and we do have a minimum parking requirement there, we don't have it in the VC2 and VC3, but we do require parking in MRT. We can't say that these units count and that these will be built if there isn't a way to build them and to build the parking. So from their perspective, that's actually a really important part, is the MRT, and making sure that there can be some site work done to accommodate parking in particular. They'd prefer to see no regulations on retaining walls.
So going back to Brayland and Chase Street, and you saw the unbelievable retaining wall on Chase Street. And then further down, that lot has been subdivided and they're doing, 2 MRT lots with 4 units. I think it'll go down to 3. And it's a slope lot and they have 4 feet retaining wall in the back and they're making that work. If they got 10 feet, they would use 10 feet because then it wouldn't be as sloped. And so I'm worried that this is just a big loophole for developers. And then that house on Brayland is going to have a 10-foot retaining wall in their backyard plus a 6-foot fence on top of it. I mean, I want to consider the neighbors too. I want to keep going on this. Another statement you made in the memo said only retaining walls in VC2 and VC3 exceeding 4 feet, which are constructed for underground parking, would be allowed by right. And no by right retaining walls could be constructed for surface parking when there's no minimum parking requirement. But in what you wrote, you allow for loading docks. So you could have up to 10 feet. And I'm thinking in Dunstan West, in West Newton, where it slopes down to the river. So you would be able to have a 10-foot retaining wall in the back there in a VC2 and VC3 zoning.
So if the retaining wall is inside the building, or not the retaining wall, if the loading dock, which would be attached to the building, I think we have to, for commercial properties, we have to allow for loading to happen.
But again, I think most people would make the 4 feet work, but if you give them 10 feet, it would make it easier to work. That's what I'm worried about. And then my next thing, and this is more for the law department, the Chevron deference, the Supreme Court overturned that in June of this year. And in the case of the MBTA Communities Act, the legislation assigned administrative agency the authority to write the rules, but this seems to be going beyond the scope of the legislative authority. And that's something maybe for the law department. I mean, getting into these details for our town about retaining walls, I think it's just too much in the details.
I can respond to that.
Okay. Oh, we do have law. I'm sorry. Thanks.
The law department online.
What was that?
Joined by you.
Oh, yes.
Let's speak up.
Yes, so we have looked at this and we think that these requirements do fall within their reason to have this be allowed to be built by right. We don't think that the retaining walls go beyond the scope of making sure that these units can be built by right.
Can you just restate that a little louder? We're trying to get your, I don't know if it's at your end or our end, but.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better.
The law department has taken a look at this and we believe that the retaining wall requirements do fall within the scope of ensuring that these units can be built by right.
Okay. All right, thank you. I should just note that we're joined by Councilor Lucas, whom I didn't recognize before, but welcome, and Councilor Greenberg, I believe, have joined us. So, okay. No, I thought I had another comment for question in the committee. Councilor Albright.
So I mean, if this is gonna satisfy them and get us back into compliance, I feel like we need to try it and keep our eye on it and see what develops with it, especially in the hillier parts of our VCOD. And then have a look at it, and if we need to change it, we go back again. So I think we need to move along.
Councilor Oliver.
Thank you. I am, like, I think we have gotten to a point within the council that compliance with this makes sense. I agree with Councilor Wright. I still want to, like, I'm not ready to support this the way this is written yet. It does seem to me that what we're trying to find is the right balance point here, obviously. I think the state is coming our way, and you know, we just need to continue to look at the options that, or the possibilities of what we might get. Because when we start to think about MRT, because the map in my head that showed all of those lots, it's pretty far ranging, right? It's by far the largest number of lots. I don't want to like make anything up here, but it's the largest number of lots. They are much further astray than VCs. We might actually see more MRT in the future as we add one, perhaps, you know, on the ends. We're gonna get more variation in topography. I think we need to keep pushing on this because we know that these retaining walls, as much as we know nobody wants to build them because they're expensive, I keep looking at the Great Eaton Corner and what it did to every single one of those abutters, not just their quality of life, but literally, you can't control the water. We've got people who live in homes now who, I don't want to overstate this and be dramatic, but what we allowed to happen on an abutter's property really did some significant damage to abutters. I think 10, like, yes, I'm looking at 10 feet going, wow, that's kind of tall. Well, I mean, I don't know, but you know, it's maybe those lights are a little bit higher than 10 feet. That's a lot, especially when we're talking about a couple of feet from a lot line. I don't know. I'm sorry, but the way this is written is probably acceptable to them. Makes sense, for it is acceptable to them, and I get why. I'm not quite sure it's acceptable to me yet, because we've been down this road. We have seen some good things, and we've also seen some really bad things. And as a city councilor here, I really do have to default to the yes, but all of the abutters to every single MRT in this city are looking to us to make sure that they don't get that kind of retaining. 10 feet, 9.5 feet, something in those lines, that's a lot. No pun intended. That's high.
I'm trying to, can I?
So let me just try and make sure I've got everybody. I have Councilor Lucas who hasn't spoken, and I'd like to recognize a member of the council who hasn't spoken yet. Councilor Lucas, welcome again.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, good. I got the headphones on, so we should be good. Ms. Kyra, you were talking about parking requirements in the VCOD, and you said there's no parking requirement in VC2 and VC3, I think. Didn't we put in a small parking requirement in VC3 as a late amendment last year?
Yeah, sorry, on lots over 20,000 square feet.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right, I just wanted to be clear on that. But I do have other comments and questions and all that. But the other thing is, I don't know why we're talking about retaining walls at all. I really don't know why. When we were doing VCOD last year, I remember it being advised that we do not put in a parking requirement because then there will be less space for housing, because the parking requirement coming from the coming in the MBTA zoning formulas, excuse me, it was to assume that the parking was on the surface level. And now we have HLC saying, no, you need to amend the retaining wall ordinance to allow for underground parking. But last year they were talking about surface parking. Can you explain that?
So I can try, again, this isn't coming from us. We're trying to do our best here to get us into compliance. Yes, the model was not sophisticated enough to account for underground parking. So we gained units by not having parking requirements. It worked in our favor and that the model spit out more units than were likely to be built if we assume no parking, because the model was assuming surface parking. We did put a parking requirement in MRT. So there is a parking requirement. So we do have to make sure that you can meet the parking requirement. Now, nobody knew what exactly the stage review was going to look like. They are looking to make sure things actually are buildable. So they are making sure that there are not other rules in there that are going to prevent by right development. And retaining walls is one of the big ones they flagged. I mean, I think that's as much as I can explain it.
Okay, I mean, you can't speak for HLC and I completely get that. I get it. Is there any way we can speak directly to HLC, the city council, and I mean ZAP? Are they allowed to speak to HLC?
Sure. I will say you can try. They are incredibly busy. We have really struggled with this to get their attention on this because they are moving on. They have a whole other set of communities that have a deadline at the end of this year, far more than were the deadline of last year. So they're trying to help us and work with us to get somewhere, but they don't have to. And they also now need to be answering all the questions for all the other communities that still have to submit zoning and reviewing all of that zoning. So I don't think there's anything that would stop you from reaching out to them or them from speaking with you. I will say their time is very difficult to get.
I would say cautious about committing the committee to a conversation. Bureaucrat, let's put it that way. No disrespect.
Well, yeah. Well, Chair Baker, I'm not on the committee, so I won't be party to those conversations. But thank you. The other thing I want to talk about is I don't see any benefit to the city of Newton. I really don't, to approving this new ordinance or amendment to the BCOD for retaining walls when we still have three train stations that are in desperate need of upgrades. And in a letter that the commissioner or the director, the secretary of HLC sent us a letter last November when we were voting on the BCOD. And in his letter, the secretary wrote that the Healy-Driscoll administration favors the creation of by right development near train stations when they make their transportation investments. I read that as, if we included Auburndale, which we did, they would this would look favorably to the state when they make investments. And quite frankly, they have failed at that. They have not made the investments to West Newton and the Auburndale train stations. So I don't see why we should do this when they have failed to hold up their end of the bargain. It is state property. I mean, just think of this. This is all about the creation of by right housing near train stations, and yet we don't have adequate train stations. Think about that. So, I am not in favor of this amendment at all. It's nothing against the work that planning has done to create this ordinance and their work with HLC, but I do not see a benefit to the city of Newton for passing this amendment to the BCOD. I'll leave it at that. And I'm all set. Thank you, Chair.
Let me just recognize, we can give planning an opportunity to respond, but I want to make sure that we have, I believe, Ward 3, where I thought I saw.
Yes,
there she
Councilor
is.
Malachy.
Councilor Malachy, the panes move around on this screen a bit, and so I lose you. Unfortunately, the hand is obscured in part because you've got an autumn.
I need a nice winter scene.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for a good snowstorm to get trees and snow. But anyway, to me, it feels very hypocritical on the part of the state when this whole MBTA communities was premised on, you know, housing near transit, and they had no parking requirements themselves, and we're actually encouraging people not to have parking requirements, to then turn around and say, you have to enable this developer to build parking and not work within the lot that they're dealt with and that they chose to buy. I think it was Ms. Carver said, oh, don't worry, it's so expensive to do these retaining walls. We probably won't get many of them. But when you think about it, parking is a valuable asset. And if it's going to get them more parking spaces, sure, they'll build the walls. And my last point, I think anyone who thinks that, oh, if we pass this and it doesn't work out, we can reverse it. The state will never let us reverse it once it's passed. So I am not prepared to support anything, any changes at all on this from what we've got. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your participation. The committee's got to reach a decision, obviously, and then we'll see where it goes to the council. Let me recognize Councilor Albright, and then I'll come back to Ms. Kyra.
I'm trying to understand, the parking has to be in the back, so the retaining wall would be in the back. And it could be up to 10 feet if it's a steep hill and you come up with a flat thing. So I'm trying to imagine, and I'm not really good at it, how the abutters would be affected. It's not like your wall, which is amazing. Yeah.
Twice as big. I understand.
Yeah, but no, it's not only is it big, but it's in somebody else's backyard. This would be the backyard of the home that has to go down 10 feet to get to a parking space.
Yeah, so, and again, I wanna say it's only for a few parking spaces, right? So it's a maximum of 4 parking spaces that this would allow. So to Councilor Malachy's point, there isn't an incentive to build bigger walls to get more parking because parking is valuable. You're only getting the wall to meet your minimum parking requirement. That is on there, so you have to provide parking. We did not remove parking requirements across the board. So we are requiring parking, so we need to make sure you can build the parking. But you're only getting a wall to build the minimum number of spaces, which is 4 maximum if you do new construction, MRT with 4 units. The wall would depend on the site. It could be along the side in order to get the driveway back, in order to sort of, get to a flatter spot. It's hard to say exactly where it would be. It would depend on the size of the lot too. We see these, there's quite a few examples around the city in the front where they get higher than 10 feet as on the houses that are sort of set up and someone carves out a parking space right at the front.
But they can't do that here.
They could, yeah, no, because we have a 12-foot parking setback. So we won't see those right on the street. We'll see, they'll be less visible, but maybe visible to a neighbor. But they'll be more in the rear, the parking or the wall maybe along the side to get a driveway down. Again, 10 feet, I think, is not going to be a typical scenario. The MRT, or not the MRT, we have a couple egregious examples, but that's over many years of not regulating retaining walls outside the setbacks. So for many years, you could go as tall as you want outside the setbacks. And we have one really egregious example, and that is enough to, I think, change the regulations, which we did. But that was also someone who was trying to put a pool in their single family home that, yeah, I mean, these are smaller lots. They're just trying to accommodate the housing. They're not putting pools or tennis courts or anything like that. They're not gonna fit on these lots. Again, this is up to the council. We, I think, are trying to get us to a place where we can come into compliance, but it's the council's ultimate decision whether we come into compliance. But just need to understand, the ramifications aren't just that we don't get West Newton or Auburndale stations upgraded. It's that we do not access any grant funding, that the housing authority loses money. I don't know what it means for the Newtonville station. That's way above my pay grade. But there are consequences to not being in compliance.
Yeah, and the Supreme Judicial Court hasn't ruled yet on the Milton case, so we don't know what they're gonna say there.
So, let me just clarify, I want to give members of the committee, and then Mr. Lamel, but did you have?
No, I think that you were asking for visualization.
Yeah.
And I don't want to belabor this, but I sort of feel as if once we get one building, there's the minimum of the, the 3 to 4, and then I'm concerned another building goes up. There's gonna be a minimal amount of ability on this lot to do all of
Well,
this.
you can't do more than one building without getting a special permit. So you're not gonna have 2 buildings on one lot that each have the 4 parking spaces and need walls without a special permit.
Right, but once you go into the special permit, are you not allowed then to be able to like ask for higher? I think.
Yeah, but that's up to all of you.
No,
You would
I'm
have to
just
grant.
saying- Yeah, no, I'm just sort of.
That's the same as the over 4 feet we have now.
Right, and that, I think you were asking for visualizations. I'm concerned that now that we're talking about this, that in fact, has it been played out by you in any way so that then you can see what this looks like, in terms of, the potential? In terms of, okay, you were talking about a driveway and then getting up to the back leveled parking area. I think that it might be helpful to see some visualization, just what this means, in terms of what they look like.
We can, let us think about that. We do not have scope for that right now.
Okay.
Our scope with UTL on the Village Center ended a year ago. Our consulting money is spoken for.
Oh, do you have even the capacity to do this kind of visualization? I mean,
You're talking about like 3D renderings?
right, no, I'm just trying to get to a place, yeah.
I think we could do some. I think, but the question is, as I think Councilor Oliver said, it's highly variable, right? And we can show it just, okay, here's what happens when the slope, if the site slopes up and up from the street, like on Ripley, in Newton Center, or if it slopes down like somewhere else. I think we could show that, but every site is different.
I know this.
So let me ask a question, because I'm not eager to send something out that fails and then put us in non-compliance. I would rather get us to compliance if we can. Where did the 10 come from? Just is there a lesser number that we could?
The state's not gonna give us a number.
No, but I mean, let's put it simply, if we said, all right, 6 feet, that's 7 feet. I don't know what the magic number is, but.
They told us,
some-
don't do 6 feet.
Okay.
Actually, they're not gonna give us a number. They
Right.
said, don't go with
Right.
this.
Don't do 6.
Maybe.
Because I'm.
6 was just too close to 4.
It's just not giving much wiggle room.
Yeah, I guess part of the what I'm hearing from our colleagues who are not on the committee, and I'm conscious that we try and cook things as thoroughly as we can inside our committee before we bring them out and into a floor fight, that if there is some way to look at the situations and make a rational case that the number of a lower number would work, but still not deprive people of the as of right opportunity. I think that might be a reasonable response in the committee context to getting something that we could go back to them. I'd rather not take out something that fails at the council level and then we're stuck, because then we can't reconsider it without a majority vote of the council within a year, and that just puts us in a mess. So if there's a way that within the limits of your limited capacity, I understand that, to do some kind of visualizations that might get us a number that we could defend as of right, but be a lower number to respond to the concerns. I would like to see if that's possible. That's just my view as a member of the committee, but I don't know how the rest of you feel about it.
Well, I was just thinking as this conversation was going on that there might be a bit of a simpler solution. Obviously, if it's supported, but I think Councilor Lucas, Councilor Maliki brought up that the MBTA Communities Act rewards no parking requirements. And I think if the concern is surface parking, and surface parking particularly enabled through very large retaining walls, then if the parking requirement is removed from MRT, which was added by later on after the fact, I think the planning department recommended no parking requirement, then you don't have to have this allowance by right for any surface parking with a retaining wall. You only can have the allowance for the underground parking, which it seems that there is support for. So that's obviously up to all of you, but that could be one very simple way and not further enable retaining walls, higher retaining walls by right.
I guess my concern is that
It's incredible.
you're accurate, but I'm not sure that's the problem that I want to go to, because that opens up the whole VCO, I mean, the MRT framework, and at least personally, that's not yet where I want to be. But let me recognize Councilor Danberg and I see where.
Yeah, the question on what the retaining walls would enable. It would enable, number one, parking. And did you also say that it is so that we could get a loading dock if loading docks are needed, or is that not what we're talking about?
Yeah, but that would only be in VC2 and VC3 where you have commercial development. You need to allow
Okay.
for a loading dock. I think we require a loading dock.
Okay, that's only in VC2 and VC3, but not in.
No loading docks in MRT.
So, let me ask you all, if
You could build one.
if it's possible, again, I know that you may end up where you have to go back to the state and say, look, this is what the council will accept, and let us go with that. But I would like this, at least this is my view, to get a little more nuanced version of the height. If you can look at whether in fact, 8 feet would work, and somehow respond to these concerns in a way that we could send it out from the committee and say, we've squeeze this until the pip squeaks, or whatever the right answer is.
Is there comfort with 8 feet? Just in the interest of time, the committee doesn't meet again until January. At some point, I suspect the state's just gonna tell us we're out of compliance, which right now we're in this conditional compliance where we're still eligible for grant funding and all of those things. At a certain point, I think we just become out of compliance. So in order to save some time, and not come back in January with a number, see if that's acceptable, then go back and forth. Is 8 feet acceptable to the committee? Because then we can try and get time with the state to talk about that in advance of a January meeting. But it'd be helpful to have a number now.
There's not many options.
There are not many options.
Yeah, I mean,
I mean, look, I would start at 7. I would start at 7 with your conversations and go to 8.
I mean,
I'm serious, we didn't hear all of that, Councilor Kalis, let me pause for a second, the question from the department is, we're being bid at 8, and
best offer.
Would 8 feet enable us to get what we need?
Yes, no, yeah.
well,
No.
we're trying to find
But what's the number you're comfortable
we
with?
know that 6 will not work.
We know
right?
6 won't
So
work,
we're-
7 might be pushing it, maybe 8 works, I
Yeah.
don't know.
All right, so I'm gonna recognize Councilor Kalis to say what he wants to say again, and then Councilor Oliver.
I was just gonna say, let Ms. Kyra go back and start at 7. If it needs to go to 8, then it does, and I'd be comfortable with that.
Councilor Oliver.
Thank you. So I'm not quite sure any of us have the answer to the question yet. Because I think the real question is, what, I mean, in order to create the conditions, in order to meet the housing and the parking, I think we're pontificating without actually like rolling up our sleeves, so to speak, and like looking at where we have MRTs. So is it 7, is it 8, is it 9.5, is it 7.5? I don't know. I don't think any of us do yet. I think that's the point. How do we get, how do we get to that? I'm not entirely sure what the kind of the critical path there is, other than like, I just need to, someone needs to basically all but prove to me, right? Look, this isn't gonna be a problem. We don't have these radical topography changes in MRT, or we do, and it's, we're looking at a 6-foot drop off front to back of the property. Well, then, okay. Let's have that conversation. You know what I mean? Like, and I get the interest of time, and I don't, again, being out of compliance is not the goal here by any means. It's something, quite frankly, I think everybody involved, and not just at this table, want to avoid. The state doesn't want to push Newton out of compliance. They want to work with us. So I'm not really sure that, now granted, I haven't been on the phone calls. I don't see how EOHLC looks at Newton and goes, you're out. Without us coming back and saying, we need some time to look at this and come back with a better, the right number. And I know that kind of puts you guys in a bit of a box too, but.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking for a significant amount of analysis. So looking at every MRT site and all the possible permutations, because part of the issue is adaptive reuse. So we have to allow for new construction where it's a blank slate, right? And we
It's
have.
not a blank slate with adaptive.
No, I know. I said we have to allow for new construction with a blank slate. And we need to allow for adaptive reuse where you're retaining the house. These houses are in all different positions on the lot. You're trying to guess at where the addition will go, where parking will go, how you'll access it. We do not have the capacity to run a development scenario on every MRT lot and tell you what the minimum height of a wall would be. I think we need to get a level of comfort with a number and try our best to get that through the state and then to pay close attention to what gets built and what that looks like. Again, we went many, many years with no regulations outside the setbacks, and people could build the biggest walls they wanted, and we only saw a couple egregious examples. I do not think the incentive is there to build giant walls everywhere just because you're allowed. Again, it's only allowing for a couple of parking spaces. But to do the analysis, I did go through and look at topography on these sites and look at some of the steeper sites and look at our parking dimensions and get a sense of like what sort of grade change you're seeing over a parking stall and what that might require. 10 feet to us felt like we would accommodate almost all lots. 8 feet may be acceptable to the state, but to do this analysis, this level of work and analysis over a foot or so of retaining walls, I don't think there's the benefit there. So I'd like to, again, not to make this go on 3-4 more months and a lot of back and forth. Again, it takes us a while to get a meeting with the state. They have a lot of other things on their plate, including ADUs, which we may talk about tonight. So if we can get, if 8 feet feels comfortable generally, or, we can try for 7, we can go back and see if that seems possible before a January meeting. We can take another look at some of the topography to make sure we're comfortable that that's going to work. But to do sort of renderings and all of this analysis, when we're talking about a foot or two of wall, I don't know that we can take that on.
All right, Councilor Danberg, and then I'm gonna make a comment or two myself.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the Braylon Ripley Chase area. There are huge hills. We've got the Andover Newton, big Andover Newton Hill. I don't think 7 feet would do it in that neighborhood. And I think I could probably say 8 would, I could go with 8.
So let's let me comment that I'm hearing from counselors not on the committee, but also on the committee concern about the 10. And I think that there's that's not going to be a successful sale at the council. And I don't want us to be in a position of taking something out that we can't at least defend. I guess my question to the members of the committee, if we said as a presumptive matter, subject to a check by the department, you can run some spot checks on some of these grades. Either 7 or 8, whichever you think is the lowest number that you can defend on the basis of an analysis. Because I think you have to go to the state and say, we just didn't pull this number out of the air. We went and looked at some of these and we think this will work in those rare cases where it might be necessary. That you try that on and see if it will work. And then bring that result back to us in January. Is that an acceptable solution to the committee and to the department? Because I think that the lowest number above 6 is going to be the most successful number and beyond the count, beyond our committee. We know that, right? And so there's no and I know you know that, and you want to get it through the council. At the same time, we don't want to be out of compliance. So if that's agreeable to committee and to the department, I would think that that would be the best way to proceed for the next meeting. It does require some spot analysis. You can't do, but you can certainly go visit Councilor Danberg's neighborhood and,
Center's hilly.
Newton Center is
Yeah.
where
There's some other spots too. And it's the odd sort of.
Has some.
Yes.
And some of it may be the other way around. And the point that Councilor Oliver was making, if you're doing a cut into the hill where the person behind you stays at the same
Yeah.
grade, that's one thing. But if you're building up so that you can put the parking space in, the person behind is now facing a retaining wall and the drainage is working against them. That's the kind of scenario that our colleagues are concerned about, and with justification. So I think that we really need to be able to make the case that this is the absolute minimum number that we think is reasonable in the context. And then say the state, this is, you don't want to put Newton out of compliance over a foot if we can get it through the council and we're all home. You go deal with all these other communities where you got much bigger problems. Is that a fair solution? Okay, so let's, I'd entertain a motion to hold on this then. Is that appropriate? Okay. Excuse me. Wait a minute, Councilor Chrisman, please defer to the. Councilor Chrisman is standing by.
Well, I listened to everybody. I thought about it carefully, so I'll move hold.
All right, Councilor Chrisman, I appreciate that very much. Let's move hold. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the ayes have it. Okay, folks, it's almost 10 o'clock. No, Councilor, sorry, planning board, sorry, Kevin, Mr. McCormick.
I'd like to get a motion to hold.
Could I make a statement first?
Well,
Yeah, since I've had to sit here since 7 o'clock.
You've been a minute time, but sure.
Yeah, I'm listening to the committee. I said this the other night at land use, that the council and the voters made a brilliant compromise on VCOD. And I think we have to keep in mind that we don't want to lose that. There are many of us in the city. I live in Thompsonville. I live in Newton Center. I believe that the compromise was brilliant and that we have to do everything reasonable to not undercut this. I recognize the power of the Commonwealth. During my misspent youth, I was a lawyer for the Commonwealth. I know what power they have. But I think we have to decide that job one is to preserve VCOD. And maybe there are many other ways to deal with the Commonwealth than you people have to put your necks in every day to go back and forth with them. But I think VCOD is job one, and that's really what I wanted to say. I was part of the debate just as a citizen when VCOD was being proposed, and I know all the hate and discontent and, you know, some really bad behavior in my view that went into that, but a brilliant compromise was reached, and I just hope that the council and this committee will keep that as well as job one. And now I'll second the motion.
Thank you. Any other comments on the motion? All in favor? Aye. Any for?
Okay.
Any opposed? Thank you, Chair.
No, I'm sorry. I just want to make sure you got everybody on your.
Yeah.
Okay, so, thank you. Now, folks, it's 5 minutes to 10 and, we've got accessory apartments, but I'm personally not prepared to try and take up a major discussion on this item tonight at this hour. I don't think it's fair to the planners. I certainly don't think it's fair to the public. Let me just make a couple of comments that I think may enhance the conversation when we bring it up next time. And we won't be able to set it for a public hearing yet because I really think we need to have a conversation first. I think the department has done some helpful analysis and preparation here. I have a couple of requests for the next time, which is that it would be helpful to distinguish, if possible, those elements which are in the department and the law department's judgment are required in order to comply with the statute versus those elements which are prudential that the department's recommending independently. I'm not sure they're entirely teased out in my.
Into that now. So everything we're proposing is required. However, it's only required for by right ADUs. So we did not, except for the alternate version we provided at the request of the chair that kept the owner occupancy for larger special permit ADUs. We didn't do two sets of requirements, but we're not proposing anything beyond what is required. We just applied it across the board rather than just to the 900 square foot ADUs and have different rules for the special permit ADUs.
Yeah, I understand that, and I'm sorry, I want to be clear about that. You basically took what was required by the statute and applied it across the board,
Correct.
but you could devise two separate sets and say, this is what's required by the statute in the narrow part, and here's what we can do for the rest of it. It's just not designed that way. I just want to make that clear. And then there's the other question of the rest of the owner occupancy for special permits, which is a sort of a special case on top, which I appreciate you including because I think it's an important opportunity. So, but it may be helpful for the next meeting just to have a copy of the statute. I brought it with me, but people, you know, don't understand where this all came from. It's not long, it's 2 sections, but it also gives the department the authority to, which it didn't really have clearly in the case of the VCOD, you know, to actually do regulations, not just guidelines. So they've got regulations which are in draft form and they're still being cooked.
And they probably won't be finalized until they go into effect. So
Yeah.
they'll likely be finalized by the February 2nd date. And whether we do anything or not, the statute and those regulations will be in effect as of February 2nd. We just don't.
You know, I hope we can take this up at our first meeting in January so that we'll have time to give to it and we'll have time for VCOD and maybe we can get a short discussion of whether it's 8 or 7 and deal with the other item expeditiously. So, but we'll work with you on the agenda setting for the meeting when we meet. But otherwise, I would entertain a motion to hold I'm
Just
sorry.
a quick clarification, so we can make sure to act on the request. When you refer to the rest of it for the ADUs, you mean requirements for those undergoing the special permit process?
No, no, what I was trying to understand, we had this conversation in the planning meeting, and so just so the members of the committee understand. The statute carves out a specific kind of ADU that's available under the statute as of right with certain parameters. It's possible, at least as I understand it, for the city to say, okay, that piece we're going to adopt. And then, but we retain some of the other things separately for anything bigger or for special permit. You know, we could retain aspects that we think are wise and just meet the city's requirements. I mean, the state requirement. What the planning department has given to us is said, it's simpler from our point of view if you take what is required and make it uniform across the board. Not just those narrow cases that the statute covers, but deal with our definitions for accessory apartments generally. So for example, as opposed to using floor area, which is what the statute habit, we could use habitable area. And for all the others, we would use habitable area. We wouldn't use what the department recommends. So the planning department has said, in the interest of simplicity, we think it's easier and better to go forward with the uniform set of rules across the board. Also, at my request, they included the owner occupancy for those special permit categories, which I think is still worth preserving, even though it's not allowed as in the as of right situation. But that's a judgment for the committee to reach. I just want to be clear about what we're looking at and how it came to be, because it could have been done differently. It would have been a much more complicated document, and the department said, let's try it out on the simple version first before we go to the complex version. If the committee wants to do the complex version, you can do the complex version, but we don't have to, let's not start there, right? Is that a fair summary?
That's definitely fair, and I
Okay.
think, you know, for the ease of our inspectors as well, not just from our perspective that it's simpler, but for those who actually.
No, I mean, there are a lot of prudential reasons for doing it. I don't mean to say that it's and we have to decide that. I'm just trying to explain where we came out and how the document appeared the way it did. So that when people look at the statute, when they see the statute, they'll say, wait a minute, how does this all fit together with what we've got?
So can I ask a process question?
Sure.
Would it make
Yes.
more s-
That's usually my
I mean,
job.
no, it's
I
your
know.
job.
Sorry.
Sorry. Taking your job. Would it make more sense to just if I wanted to talk about changing the size, would it just make more sense to docket an item to talk about that?
Why don't we wait until we get through this? If you don't, you can do it. You can docket anything you want, but it may come out in a conversation as we deal with this on next time. And then you see where you
Okay,
go.
so I'll wait and see how it goes.
Yeah.
I mean, if we determine to limit the changes that the state are requiring, and I'm gonna oversimplify because I have to. 900 square feet and under, okay, the state's rules apply. 900 and over, our rules apply, the existing rules. It could be almost that simple. It's not,
It's not.
but
It's,
that's kind of
It's
the,
not.
like, that is the set of existing.
I'm gonna have.
At 5
you
minutes
all
to 10
explain
or
the
even.
size, that they measure things differently, if
Yeah.
it's under 900 or over 900.
At 10 o'clock at night, I'm not prepared even to say that accurate or inaccurate. I'm just prepared to say it's 10 o'clock. And that much I can do. So. Oh, yes, we have another item. But wait a minute, let's vote on this one. I'm sorry.
We have a motion to hold.
Motion to hold. Wait a minute, where's Counselor Franklin?
Motion to hold.
No, there he is.
Move hold.
We hold. Thank you very much. All right, this is the accessory item and we'll hold that. And then we do have one item, which I think we can.
have to vote on
Oh, aye.
All those in favor of the motion to hold. Thank you.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Next item is the reappointment of Dan Green. And
We didn't make him wait, did we?
no, he's a reappointment. He's not.
Yeah, I think he's, Ward 6.
Yeah.
Move to,
Rick Moore.
I have a bunch of comments I need.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, all right, folks, taking entertain a motion to adjourn. All right, all those in favor, and thank the department for their patience. I hope you all have a good holiday. Notwithstanding, looking at the numbers of retaining wall height. You know, as your
Dreaming of
holiday.
Mercury. Topography.